but also shifts on the international stage. Counter-revolutionary states such as the UAE and Saudi Arabia are initiating domestic reforms, but also taking on aggressive campaigns at home and abroad, from attempting to stamp out political Islam to interventions in Libya and Yemen. And these intra-regional changes in political dynamics have profoundly reformed the region since the Arab uprisings of 2011, whilst also reflecting growing autonomy and fault lines within the region. However, they were also indicative of important shifts in big power priorities. From the US withdrawal from Afghanistan to the growing influence of China, there is much discussion of an ostensible shift in US policy away from the Middle East. The successive wave of US presidents from Bush to Biden have demonstrated interesting opportunities for comparative analysis of the impact of US policy on the Middle East, for example. From a focus on democratization under Bush to America First under Trump, and now a pivot to the East from Biden. How are these changing dynamics impacting the Middle East across political, economic, security, social, and cultural perspectives? Those are the things we're going to discuss today. Before I introduce our esteemed panel of speakers, I'd just like to remind everyone that if you want to use a hashtag to discuss this on Twitter, you can use the hashtag MEConf, and please tag the accounts either on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Just a reminder, for those of you who are registered, you would have received an email detailing a language interpreting app that you can download for Android or iOS. So please do that if you want to get a interpreting. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Oh yes, just a quick reminder, Q&A, obviously we encourage engagement from our audience. As Dr. Hassan mentioned this morning, a thing that makes a great conference, in addition to the speakers, is the contributions from the participants. So please, if you have any questions, just use the Q&A tool and reply to all panelists. If you need to change the view, there's a little tab on the right of your screen where it says layout that you can use to adjust the screen to your preference. And yes, now I would like to introduce our speakers. And in light of the theme of the panel, we have a very transnational set of speakers joining us from London, Atlanta, and Doha. First up is Dr. Lina Khatib, who is the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House, who will be talking about international foreign policies towards the Middle East between disengagement and pragmatism. Following Lina is Dr. Courtney at Emory University in Atlanta and the London School of Economics. Dr. Courtney will be talking about transnational movements in a globalized world, regional rivalries, and ideological competition. Courtney has recently authored the great book on tribalism and political power in the Gulf, state building and national identity in Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE, co-authored with Alanud Asharek, and published with Bloomsbury last year. It's a great book, and I highly recommend reading it. And last but certainly not least is Abdulla Etaibi, who's a lecturer on the International Affairs program at Qatar University. And he will be presenting on changing regional alliances and patterns of behavior. Abdulla also has an upcoming publication, hopefully to be released in March, called Identity and Globalization, Tribal Identity in the Age of Social Media. Obviously a topic very close to my heart, and that'll be published with the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University. So that's our lineup today, obviously a great lineup. Before they start, I'll just hand you over to our moderator, Dr. Stephen Wright, who's the Associate Dean for Student Affairs here at the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. Dr. Steve, I'll just hand it over to you. And thanks again for joining everyone, and I hope you enjoy what should be a great panel.
Thanks very much, Mark, and welcome everyone. We're very grateful that you attended this session. We've got a very large number of people who've connected in today, so I think it promises to be a very interesting and very lively panel, especially as we unpack some of the key issues dealing with the international connections of the Middle East region, which nicely builds on what Professor Cradley spoke about this morning. So without further ado, I'll just introduce our first speaker. So our first speaker will be Lina Khatib, and she'll be speaking on international foreign policies towards the Middle East between disengagement and pragmatism. Lina, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be part of this really interesting conference. I had the pleasure of watching the keynote speech this morning, and I thought it was a great start. A lot of the arguments relate to what I'm going to talk about today, although today I'm going to talk more about the international relations side of the story as opposed to the more theoretical, conceptual side of the story. I'm focusing on power dynamics in the Middle East. In relation to two key issues. The first one is that despite all this talk about US disengagement, we have to remember that US-Middle East relations remain relevant. The second point I want to talk about is to do with regional trends, and I know my co-panelists will talk more in detail about that, but the way I'm approaching it is to say that the way regional trends are going in the Middle East right now show us that it is pragmatism that is the main characteristic of geopolitics. Now, when it comes to US disengagement from the Middle East, we know that the Middle East is now not very high on the list of US foreign policy priorities. The US is not playing a hands-on role in seeking, for example, to end the various conflicts that are raging in the Middle East, like the Syrian conflict. The US has more of a focus right now on China and Russia. However, rather ironically, US disengagement has contributed to how both Russia and China have found in the Middle East an opportunity to increase their own international standing. But while I would not overstate China's influence and engagement in the Middle East, I caution that Russia in particular has found in the Syrian conflict an opportunity. It's an opportunity to try to present Russia as a superpower once more, an opportunity for Russia to, in a way, stand up to mainly the United States. So here Russia is actually being pragmatic. It detected a power vacuum in the US disengagement and sought to utilize it. Now, why am I not overstating China? China is also being pragmatic. There has been, as we can see, an increase in economic engagement by China in the region, whether through an economic deal that was recently signed between China and Iran, whether through vaccine diplomacy between China and UAE, or climate diplomacy with a number of states in the region, with China presenting itself, for example, as a cheaper provider of renewable energy infrastructure than many countries in the West. But this hardly means that China is going to dominate the economies of the region or replace the US. And this is where Dean Crady's keynote speech earlier resonates, because the speech warned us against applying simplistic notions to the study of power relations. Power dynamics in the Middle East are not a matter of one actor moving along only for another to neatly occupy their space. And they are certainly not about ideology driving policy in a kind of linear way. What I argue instead is that ideology is a tool wielded by actors to pursue their political and geopolitical interests. For example, I argue that it would be simplistic and inaccurate to use dichotomies like the Saudi-Iranian rivalry or the Sunni-Shia competition, or to use notions like countries are a playground to explain alliances and crises in the region. So my argument really is that local, regional, and international dynamics are interlinked. And it's not a simplistic case of one power moving and another occupying and things being kind of done in a linear way. And here I'll give you two concrete examples. The first example is Iraq. For a long while, much of the discourse on Iraq was about a supposed power struggle between Sunnis and Shias. Now, this is a very simplistic characterization. And as the election dynamics in Iraq continue to remind us, there is political competition among political parties within sects in Iraq, such as within the Shia sect, and also alliances that are formed across sectarian divides. So this is the kind of local dynamic that I'm talking about that is already complex. But Iraq is also an arena for US-Iranian power competition. It's not a playground. It is an arena in the sense that this competition does play out, but it's not detached from the local dynamics. That's what I mean by it's not just a notion of playground where players come and leave. And this competition between the US and Iran that is playing out explains, to a degree, Iraq's efforts recently at brokerage between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because Iraq can no longer really take US backing as a given, but at the same time, the US is not planning on withdrawing its remaining troops from Iraq. And Iran, regardless of what many observers might argue, I say does not actually want to see rampant instability in Iraq that is next door. And so the situation in Iraq is in constant flux and is quite complex. Yes, there is external power competition, but there are local dynamics. And, you know, characterizing an actor like Iran as a destabilizer may blind us to the fact that it is not in Iran's interest to see a completely unstable Iraq either. So it's a delicate situation that requires nuance. And different stakeholders in this context shift their tactics to suit their political goals. So an enemy today could become an ally tomorrow, and a political has-been can rise again to exploit a political opening and become very relevant and influential again. So this is how I would characterize the very rich power dynamics going on in Iraq. Another example here is US Gulf relations. We've just heard the mention of the Gulf crisis. Now, the US, for example, did not take sides in the Gulf crisis. Actually, it continues to act pragmatically in seeking to maintain relations with all Arab countries in the Gulf. And this manifests in divergent modes of engagement. So you have the brokerage of the Abraham Accords in the case of UAE, but you also have the designation of Qatar as a major non-NATO US ally. And so again, applying simplistic kind of lenses would blind us to the pragmatism at stake here that is going on. Now, I want to turn to examine pragmatism amongst Middle Eastern actors themselves, because pragmatism is not just about China pursuing its economic interests, but in a way staying a bit away from politics, Russia being, as I said, pragmatic to present itself as a superpower, and the US being pragmatic to maintain its interests. It's also about the countries in the region themselves. And here I'll give 4 examples. The first example is this issue that is getting a lot of attention now, which is about normalization with Syria. There's been a lot of attention mainly to Gulf states, but also Egypt to a degree, that seem to be increasing the pace of de facto normalization with the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. However, the economic impact of this de facto normalization in Syria is going to be minimal, because ultimately this normalization is less about Syria and more about the Arab actors using normalization as a tool to strengthen their own political power and security. So again, applying a kind of very simplistic lens to trying to understand this would blind us to the very realpolitik that is going on here. A second example is the gas pipe that is meant to extend from Egypt through Jordan and Syria into Lebanon to help with Lebanon's current economic crisis. Why is Egypt doing this? It's doing this because it is seeing a geopolitical opportunity here to increase Egypt's own regional profile. A third example, the recent de-escalation between UAE and Turkey. Again, here there is a trend to decouple economic engagement from political engagement to a degree, and this is likely to continue. But ultimately, the 2 tracks intersect. And when it comes to Iran, with Gulf countries looking towards the US and seeing that the US, when it comes to Iran's regional role, is really not doing very much. The attention remains on the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. And so Gulf countries will seek to protect themselves from Iranian retaliation rather than confront Iran. So this is why I would say, for example, we saw Saudi Arabia meet with Iran in Iraq. This is why the UAE continues to have economic relations with Iran, even though we've seen Houthi missiles, targeting UAE. So the disengaged stance of the United States towards Iran's regional role in Syria and Lebanon and elsewhere has actually directly affected not just Gulf disengagement from Lebanon, because we have that too, but also the way Gulf countries are dealing with Iran, because Iran geographically is right there in their region. So it is not in their interest for there to be increased vulnerability at the security level. And when it comes to Gulf disengagement from Lebanon, of course, many people in Lebanon complain about this. However, right now, in a very pragmatic way, the priority for many Gulf countries is Gulf regional security. Whatever happens in the Levant is a bit out there geographically and does not form a direct threat to Gulf country interest at the security level. And I will also say, whatever happens in the Levant when it comes to Iran's regional role also does not form a direct threat to US national interests either. Apart from, of course, when Iran-backed groups, mainly in Syria, start getting a bit too close to becoming a threat to Israel, this is where we see a bit of a military engagement from the US. But here, when I talk about disengagement, I'm talking about political disengagement. So we shouldn't confuse military attacks with political engagement. What we are seeing are very targeted, kinetic kind of responses that are tactical in nature, not strategic. Political strategy is somewhere else, and we shouldn't mix the two. And so what I'm saying really, ultimately, is that what the US does has consequences. This engagement is not neutrality. This engagement has very direct impact on what happens in the region, just as engagement also does. Now, some will say, actually, US disengagement has paved the way for these regional actors to get together. Look at UAE, Turkey, UAE, Israel. Look at Iraq hosting Saudi Arabia and Iran. My argument is none of these things are mutually exclusive from political engagement by the United States. And in fact, my preference as an analyst of international affairs is for the US to be engaged in a positive way. And so here we have it. The US stance has played a huge role in a way, catalyzing pragmatic behavior by others. But we also have to remember that US disengagement is also a pragmatic move. And that is why, in conclusion, I just want to emphasize that we need nuance when it comes to understanding these power dynamics. Clinging on to old, hard, non-shifting dichotomies blinds us to the fluid nature of geopolitics and realpolitik going on in the region. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lina, for that. That was wonderful. And I think it's fantastic that we're able to start with the big picture perspective that you were able to provide, looking at those dynamics between global powers, but then also looking at how they intersect with key issues, whether ranging from ideology, geopolitics, and then inter-regional relations as well, and also the complexity that exists amongst them and how we have to avoid oversimplification. There's a lot of issues that you've raised that need to be unpacked, and I'm sure they'll be prompting a lot of questions in the Q&A session as well. So just to remind our listeners that you can post questions through the Q&A session, through the Q&A tab. I encourage you to do so, and at the end of the session we'll have the Q&A. But as a segue from what Dr. Lina has highlighted, now we'll move on to Dr. Courtney Freer, who will be giving us a presentation on transnational movements in a globalized world, regional rivalries, and ideological competition. Courtney, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. And I think really what Dr. Khatib has mentioned will start us off quite well and is really relevant when it comes to my talk. I think she's right to point out the ascendance of pragmatism in particular, but I guess what I want to talk about is, where does ideology stand then? Because ideology does still promote or does still motivate at least some political activity. And so that's kind of what I want to look at. And so I'm going to use case studies basically of 3 Gulf countries to make a broader point about this idea of where ideology stands when we have pragmatism that's ascendant, especially in the foreign policy world, and B, the connection between domestic political decision making and foreign policy decision making, because I think there is a link between the two, but it's rarely been kind of looked at in a systematic way. So the countries that I'm going to mention in more detail to make this point are Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE. Largely because they're the easiest to compare in terms of size, in terms of demography. They're Sunni majority, expatriate majority. Economically, they're kind of the strongest, wealthiest rentier states. So when we talk about rentierism and the types of political system or political quiescence that it imagines, these states provide ways of challenging that. But despite the fact that they're very similar in some ways, they've had very different reactions to the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood after the Arab Spring and since that period in particular. And so I do want to use these cases again to make a broader point about where transnational movements stand, how they've evolved, and how various domestic governments have interacted with them and are likely to interact with them in the future. So my book that I published a few years ago was focusing on the Muslim Brotherhood in Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE, but as domestic political actors. And basically, it examined the ways in which the Brotherhood in the Gulf is distinct from branches in other parts of the Middle East. And the fact that these branches are distinct really challenges the notion that the Muslim Brotherhood is one holistic transnational movement in and of itself. And what I found is that the Brotherhood in the wealthiest kind of rentier states of the Gulf that I've looked at, they're different in 3 ways. So one, and most obviously, there's less of a need for Brotherhood movements to provide tangible social welfare in places that have put in place very handsome welfare disbursements for their citizenry. Secondly, their electoral campaigns are less relevant in these states where political parties are banned really throughout the GCC. And we only have Brotherhood members present in parliament at the moment in Kuwait among Gulf states. And thirdly, their strong tribal social networks obviate the need for Brotherhood movements to provide alternate social networks in the way that they have in certain environments where they first emerged. So for instance, these states aren't Cairo of the 1930s, where you have a lot of people moving to cities and not having kind of social connections. So they're kind of fundamentally different in terms of Brotherhood movements. But then it begs the question of how then is the Brotherhood still a transnational organization? And the argument for cracking down on local branches of the Muslim Brotherhood really throughout the Middle East has often been that the group, due to its transnational nature, fundamentally threatens national borders. There's conversation about the Ummah rather than the Watan. So it's this focus really on breaking down national borders, at least in the eyes of some of these governments. Ironically, though, I think that it is the Brotherhood's local political activities that have led to crackdowns, and this is at home as well as abroad. And I'd say the more the Brotherhood is seen as a viable domestic political actor, particularly by working with secular segments of the opposition, the more dangerous it's considered, and thus the likelier a crackdown will emerge. And this happens both at home and abroad. And so this goes against this idea of ideology being the most important and of transnationalism being the most important thing or important characteristic of Brotherhood movements. I'd say the current status of Brotherhood movements in the Gulf in particular calls into question then the viability of transnational movements, even in an increasingly globalized political environment where we might expect that, these cross-border linkages, which are so strong now, would actually foster transnationalism. I think that the current status of Brotherhood movements in the Gulf also reveals the strong link between domestic political concerns and foreign policy formulation. particularly post-Arab Spring. And by portraying the Muslim Brotherhood as a fundamentally transnational entity, some Gulf governments have managed to justify their movement against the organization both at home and abroad. And this is not just an argument that's put forward by Gulf governments. This argument about transnationalism is one that we hear about the Brotherhood kind of quite often in other settings as well. And of course, the Brotherhood did originate in Egypt in 1928, initially with the goal of Islamizing society from the bottom up. Over time, it has become more politically kind of evolved and spread across borders. Famously, many members of the Muslim Brotherhood ended up in the Gulf states, particularly in education sectors, where they were staffing kind of nascent education ministries in particular. And so these branches that emerged in the Gulf were the result of transnational ideological affinity and transnational immigration as well. Once Brotherhood movements came to the Gulf from elsewhere, however, the movements became increasingly indigenized and localized. So interestingly, these states' Brotherhood branches were created due to transnational links, which were actually fostered by these governments, which allowed for the immigration of Brotherhood sympathizers, many of them from Egypt, under escaping kind of persecution under Nasser. Or these branches emerged after GCC nationals attended universities in places like Egypt and Jordan that have kind of a strong Brotherhood presence. And so they wanted to basically emulate this model at home. So as products of transnationalism themselves, these branches have been suspected of maintaining links abroad, thereby undermining their role in some senses as national political actors. And this is an argument that you hear made by regimes throughout the region, that really the Brotherhood is focused on kind of breaking down national borders rather than focusing on kind of local issues. And there has existed an international Brotherhood apparatus, but historically it didn't really have much ability to enforce party discipline. And this is something perhaps best demonstrated by the disparate responses to the liberation of Kuwait by a US-led coalition in 1991. So we saw a splintering of Brotherhood branches in terms of their reaction to US involvement in the liberation of Kuwait. And this led, incidentally, to the Kuwaiti Muslim Brotherhood breaking its ties with the international organization and becoming increasingly locally focused. And Stephen Brooke has documented this elsewhere, that the Brotherhood's international weakness has actually emerged due to its local successes. And these local successes, particularly at the ballot box, have required engagement not with large-scale ideological issues that kind of resonate transnationally, but rather with local issues that matter to constituents. So people are voting based on what the Brotherhood will do locally, rather than on these kind of more broad-scale ideological issues. And May Darwish, in a piece that came out in 2020, argued that the disparate state reactions to the rise of the Brotherhood during the Arab Spring are often the same domestically and internationally because of the links between policy concerns at the domestic and regional levels. And I think this is something worth thinking about beyond just the Muslim Brotherhood. You know, in what ways do policy concerns at home and abroad mirror each other? And has the Arab Spring fundamentally shaped the way in which they interact? Darwish has written about the diffusion of repression in particular since the Arab Spring as a dynamic process, saying that domestic variables affect foreign policies, particularly when it comes to groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. So what has become transnational then may not be the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, but the belief that this ideology needs to be repressed. And we have seen this throughout the region since the Arab Spring. And because regional and domestic politics are taken into account to preserve authoritarian status quos at home, arguably particularly for smaller states, there's often alignment between the two. When it comes to the treatment of the Brotherhood in Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE, the states that I've tended to focus my research on, the link appears pretty clearly. So in states where the movement has not been considered politically problematic, Kuwait and Qatar, it has been engaged with abroad, whereas in a state like the UAE, in which the Brotherhood was considered part of an opposition movement in 2011, the group is maligned and has been designated as a terrorist organization. And as I've noted elsewhere, both domestic and foreign policy treatment of Islamist organizations, by and large, especially the Brotherhood, in Gulf states, and I think you could potentially broaden this argument out further, seems to vary according to the level of participation, political participation allowed and institutionalized, and B, the degree to which regimes consider these movements linked to broader domestic opposition movements. So the consideration of Islamist movements and how governments engage with them have nothing to do really with the idea that this is a transnational organization. Oftentimes, decisions about Islamist groups are couched in terms that they are transnational, but in fact, what matters is what happens at the local level. So for instance, in Kuwait, the Muslim Brotherhood is able to participate openly in parliamentary elections and thus has long been an accepted part of the country's political landscape. So domestic political openness, you could argue, has actually constrained Kuwait's foreign policy decisions, at least when it comes to political Islam. It's very difficult to, crack down on or malign an organization abroad when it's allowed to compete in elections domestically. In Qatar, the Brotherhood never became politically active, and so it's not really seen as politically threatening either at home or abroad. For the UAE, which lacks a political institution in which the Brotherhood could legally participate, some of its members' involvement, as I mentioned, in a political reform movement around the time of the Arab Spring was unacceptable, particularly in the shadow of Arab Spring uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia that ended with the rise of Brotherhood-led governments. So regime calculations about the political threat posed by the Brotherhood appear to have informed foreign policy decisions, particularly in the UAE. We hear the leadership's propagation of what they call moderate Islam as an alternative to political Islam. And this, this promotion of something called moderate Islam, this kind of apolitical Islam, also allows for things like normalization of ties with Israel, which is something that Islamist groups have historically opposed. So the experiences of the Muslim Brotherhood in Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE, I think, illustrate quite well the fragility of transnational movements, despite, again, the fact that we have increased globalization in general. And although Brotherhood movements may initially help each other across borders in their establishment, internalization seems inevitable after the initial phase of ideological diffusion to ensure that local organizations remain appealing to local constituents. So pragmatism really does come into play here. Nonetheless, I'd say the fact that that Brotherhood movements exist in various forms in some of the world's wealthiest rentier states demonstrates the flexibility of the organization and its ability to adapt its shape and activities to suit different political environments. And it is this adaptability, rather than its history as a transnational movement, which has spurred concern about the Muslim Brotherhood, about the ability of the Muslim Brotherhood to influence political discourse in the GCC states and beyond in the region more generally. Indeed, even without the aid of the Egyptian organization from which it severed ties after the Gulf War, the Kuwaiti Muslim Brotherhood has managed to maintain its position as a political and social actor in the Kuwaiti scene, arguably becoming more powerful without the backing of a mother branch. So it calls into question, how much transnationalism actually helps in terms of promoting a movement at home. And it also questions really the viability of transnational movements when internalization is necessary to maintain local followers. So despite the fact that the Brotherhood's transnationalism has diminished, domestic fears about the movement's appeal, I think, will continue driving foreign policy decisions throughout the region. Additionally, because the Brotherhood began as a transnational movement, one which, like Arab nationalism, enjoyed support throughout kind of the broader Ummah and has since its creation enjoyed appeal across borders, countries throughout the region have become focused on formulating policy responses to the grievances they voice, both at home and abroad. And even beyond the GCC, beyond the Middle East, for instance, we've seen government-led studies of political Islam in the United Kingdom. We've seen successive bills introduced in US Congress to designate the Brotherhood a terrorist organization. So there is fear about kind of the potential for transnational ideological diffusion in the Islamist sphere, I'd say very much beyond just the region of the Middle East. But again, what I found that's transnational is not really the ideological diffusion, but rather authoritarianism and crackdown. So that is kind of what we're seeing is political learning among various states in the region about ways in which to counter different ideological movements. And so I think all of this raises kind of interesting questions about the ability for kind of transnational ideological diffusion among opposition movements in particular, the extent to which it's possible, and also the extent to which it's even desirable. I mean, does transnationalism water down local appeal of ideological groups? And does transnationalism also affect ways in which governments throughout the Middle East treat various ideologically focused organizations? So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Courtney. That was fascinating. And I think, you've underlined a key point, which is that the domestic context truly matters, especially when we're looking at transnational groups, such as the Muslim Brotherhood. The political economy context that you've highlighted, tribal factors, but also then that delicate balance between being transnational but at the same time trying to be nationally focused. I think this raises a number of important questions that we can definitely unpack as we move on. But in addition to this, I think now this gives us a nice move into the next presentation by Abdulla Etaibi, who'll be talking about changing regional alliances and patterns of behavior, which builds very nicely on the transnational groups that have been identified, and also the intersection between international and regional factors that Dr. Lina has already highlighted. So Abdulla, over to you. The floor is yours, and I encourage our participants to ask questions. Okay, thank you.
So much. Just share my screen for the presentation. First of all, thank you so much for Dr. Steven and Dr. Marc for putting this together. It's such a great honor to be with all of you. So basically, I'm going to talk about the changing regional alliances and patterns of behavior in the region, with the case of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Just moving to the puzzle. We talk about inter-Arab alignments and alliances, and these are very fluid and very dynamic. You see a lot of changes in the alignments and alliances in the region. So it's very important to ask a question about how we can explain a state's choice to be aligned with a particular partner. And we have so many cases in the history where scholars try to answer. And today we're having this case. And mainly scholars looked at it from different angles. Some look at the economic factors. Some look at transnational identities and ideologies. Some even looked at internal and external threats and how you can balance the two together. Some look at system level. So there are so many takes by scholars. I'm approaching the topic from the regime security approach. I believe we need all the levels. We need the regime level, the state level, the regional, the international, because all these levels offer opportunities, incentives, challenges for the policymakers. So how they can be read by the policymakers. So here we need to look at things through the policymaker lens, and this can be achieved. But firstly, to explain and define regime. Regime is actually usually it's like a group of people. It's like the ruling institution within a state. It's include if you take it to the Gulf, it includes the ruling family and some of the top policymakers in the state, and then they included the state where you have more the government and other groups in the state. And when it comes to security, you have to look at it. What do we mean by security? Security to whom? Security from what? So all these are very important to be included. And in our case, in alignments and alliances, they usually at least focus on this for different reasons. One, for achieving survival, and secondly, to maintaining security and boost the security for the regime and the presence of the regime. And this depends on the pressing need of the regime, what the regime needs at the moment. So this is important to clarify who is the policymaker, who is representing the regime at a certain time, and his perception and to the threats he's facing. And this can tell us even what partners he can side with, and also the extent of this alignment. So our case is UAE and KSA. So usually we talk about MBS and MBZ, Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed. So let's look at how the alliance came together first before starting to talk about it in detail. So first of all, we need the international factor. Here, Donald Trump, we have a new president in 2017 who was more interested in leader-to-leader interaction more than institutions. He made the impossible possible in the region when he visited Saudi Arabia in May 2017. So that was very important for the Saudi policymaker to know that there is an international factor, international support for Mohammed bin Salman in his policies, and also in the Saudi regime in general. But why the UAE? Because here we have to go to the regional level. There are different threats for Saudi Arabia and for the UAE. Saudi Arabia, they have three major threats. Firstly, Iran. Then you have the independent foreign policy of Qatar, which created a lot of problems for Saudi Arabia since 1995 with the father Emir Hamad bin Khalifa. And then you have the Muslim Brotherhood, the challenge of that Dr. Courtney talked about it, the transnational factor of Muslim Brotherhood. So what made Saudis go and prioritize Iran, prioritize Qatar, and prioritize the Muslim Brotherhood? Because Mohammed bin Salman, he's a young leader. He came with the idea of transforming the kingdom, transforming the economy. So he needed to side either with Emirat or with Qatar to help him with his project, because these two countries, they have a lot of experience, let's say, in economy. So Qatar was more important to be against it at a certain time and to be with UAE for 2017, the Gulf crisis. How? Why exactly? Let's go to the within the state level, and here we have to go to the regime. There's a problem with because I defined it at the beginning that it's including the ruling family. So we have an intra-regime problem. When King Salman came to power in 2015, the migrant was the crown prince, but then he left in May for Mohammed bin Nayef, and then Mohammed bin Salman was the deputy crown prince. So he had the problem that he wanted to step up and go to the next position, to be the crown prince, to get ready to be the king eventually in the future. And here, Mohammed bin Nayef was closer to Qatar. We have the numbers. If we talk about it, he had his first external visit as a crown prince to Qatar in 2015, and also he had 6 meetings in 2 years with the Emir of Qatar. So that's like a big number of meetings in 2 years. So he was very close. Mohammed bin Salman maybe was more worried about Qatar being involved in his problem with Mohammed bin Nayef. Maybe in case of Qatar mediation to solve that there's a problem within the House of Saud. But with the UAE, Nayef bin Abdulaziz before, who opposed the Emirati suggestion to change the borders between UAE and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 2005, was actually not easygoing with the Emiratis. And then we had Mohammed bin Nayef, who was not actually easygoing as well. So this one, the first problem he had to get rid of. So he got rid of Mohammed bin Nayef actually after about 2 weeks of the Gulf crisis, the beginning of the Gulf crisis, on June 5th. So this was the first one. The second level, we talk about state and regime. And here it was Mut'ab bin Abdullah, who was close to tribes. He was actually the head of the National Guard, and he invested a lot on this institution to be closer to tribes. So how to get rid of him and get rid of one of the major problems in Saudi Arabia? Because when Mohammed bin Salman came, we have to look at, Gregory Goss talked about this a long time ago, like in the 80s, about the legitimacy of the Saudi regime, and it was actually based on 2 pillars. We talk about Islam and tribes. So Mohammed Salman came with the idea of creating a new pillar, which is actually the youth. So investing in entertainment authority and all his new projects. So how to listen, how to avoid having confrontation with these 2 institutions or with these 2 groups in Saudi Arabia. So firstly, the tribes. It started with the mobilization of tribes against Qatar in September 2017. Why? Basically because who took the lead, and this was Fahad bin Hatlin, who is the uncle of Mohammed bin Salman. He is the grandson of the famous Knight of Ajman in the Arabian Peninsula. So he invited tribes to the meetings against Qatar. Also, he replaced or he came after Mish'al when Mish'al passed away as the head of the Camel Club and Camel festivals in Saudi Arabia. Then he came up with the idea of international Camel organization. He became closer to tribes. Tribes member can sign up for membership in this organization, and then will get the support they need. They will have experts supporting them in their camel journey. Let's put it this way. And also, this organization will help them facilitate the deals. And one of the biggest deals we had in Saudi Arabia, it was in last month in the camel racing, where someone actually rented a camel for 48 hours for 20 million Saudi riyal. So big numbers, big deals, big achievements. He's trying to push for to become closer to tribes, and that works to some extent. And then comes to the idea of creating National Security Center in early 2018, because after getting rid of Mit'ab in the Ritz-Carlton where he imprisoned, this one was created to where the king and the crown prince became the leaders and of all the security institutions, including the National Guard. So he became, in a way, the head of the National Guard. Then we have the problem of at the beginning of the Gulf crisis, the problem of the Mosque of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab and the statement of Al Sheikh, who attacked the mosque, the name of the mosque. So what was happening actually at this time? Mohammed bin Salman was trying, and Saudi regime were trying to isolate the Wahhabism and this version of Islam from Qatar, so to be dominated by Saudis only, and then you can make your own version, which Dr. Courtney as well, so that's called the moderate, what they call it. I mean, and she mentioned that the moderate Islam. So they tried to make a new easygoing Islam where you can fit the new liberal lifestyle. And then imprisonment of a lot of Muslim scholars. It was easier to accuse these scholars of working for Qatar or have links to Qatar. That was like more easy to be digested by the domestic audience, more than accusing them, for example, to be closer to Iran. And we have examples of Salman al-Auda, Mohammed Arifi with Sultan Ghaibi with house arrest, and we have Mohammed Arifi with the travel ban. So a lot of cases with scholars. And then we have the post-Gulf crisis. This alliance and alignment between the UAE and the KSA was actually very solid in terms of coordination against Qatar during the Gulf crisis. But what happened after the Gulf crisis? We start to see a bit of problems emerging in this alignment. Why the Gulf crisis ended? We have COVID, killed the economies of the region and the world. We have a new president. We have the Democrats taken over the White House. So that pushed for the Gulf crisis. Also, the Saudis were keen on getting closer to Qatar, because Mohammed bin Salman created and like perfectly finished the new system, the new Saudi let's say system, where he controlled the Islam and the Muslim scholars, he controlled the tribes, he controlled the ruling family as well. So things were ready for him to move on and to get back to normal, let's say, with normal relations in the region. Also, after the Gulf crisis, we see better Saudi-Qatar relations. They had 10 meetings, 10 follow-up meetings for the committees. They exchanged ambassadors as well. Mohammed bin Salman had visited Qatar in December 2 months ago. He signed many agreements. One of them is for the Entertainment Authority, so where he will be having a chance to have entertainment activities in Qatar during the World Cup, which is a good source of income for the Saudi government. So he knows that the World Cup is coming up, so things need to be getting fixed as soon as possible with Qatar. Also, we're having problems coming up, such as the new Saudi law of enforcing foreign firms to have offices in Saudi Arabia to have contracts by the government. We saw the OPEC plus problem, or some people call it misunderstanding. In July, we had the Saudi tariffs on free zones products, and also products coming from Israel. And here it's very important to mention that UAE is #1 in terms of free zones. They have 45 free zones in the Gulf. So these laws targeted that alliance and that alignment. That showed that there is no common interest post 2017. Also, we have the Saudi decision to move many Saudi TV channels to their new media city. And most of these channels moved from Dubai, actually, in the United Arab Emirates. One of them is the famous Al Arabiya, which was one of the main TV platforms that criticized Qatar during the crisis. And also, we have the King Abdulaziz port in Dammam, which is being which actually in progress now to be expanded more in the Arabian Sea or Persian Sea. And also on the left side, you have the Jeddah Islamic port in the Red Sea. So they trying to expand the Mawana, which is the Saudi Ports Authority, to include more trade. And that's actually putting Qatar and also UAE in a very in the position where they're going against the Saudi project here. And also we're having the Turkish Emirati rapprochement. Many treaties were signed. One of them was for the ports by Abu Dhabi ports. And there is a 10 billion investments in Turkey to be directed to Turkey. Also, we have the problem of Saudi Emirati approaching more Iran, approaching more Syria, and supporting the southern Yemen. So these things can show us that there is a new alignment maybe showing up in the region here. We can see Qatar and Saudi become closer. So there was maybe a worry by the Emiratis that Turkey, Saudi, and Qatar may come closer more and more, and that could put Emiratis maybe under pressure. So moving to Iran, moving to Turkey, to balance Turkey, to make Turkey more neutral in terms of its positions, and they relied on the economy because the Turks actually suffering in terms of the economy and the currency. Yeah, and last but not least, I would like to say that inter-Arab alignments are not coherent. We can see many changes going on in the region. We can see many future alignments and alliances showing up in the region. And in our case study here, the immediate interest of the Saudi regime actually overshadowed the general picture of, or the problem, the real problem for the Saudi, which was Iran, but the regime was more into the immediate, the more pressing need for it. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Abdulla. That was wonderful. And you've highlighted a number of key issues now, which I think is going to be, we're going to definitely have to discuss further during the Q&A session. You've highlighted the interconnection between international, regional, and also domestic factors, and how they are playing out on a very complex chessboard. But you know, also the key issues that you highlighted relating to tribalism, economic factors, and regional outlooks, as well as the pragmatism and ebbing and flowing between the relations of the key states, makes it an incredibly complex, let's say, strategic chessboard to actually understand exactly what the behavior is. I mean, I think one of the key issues that I would like to hear more about is, of course, looking at the nature of UAE's engagement with Turkey. What is the key nature behind that, and also how is that best explained? So I think that's one of the things I would like you to pick up on during the Q&A session. But now, as we're in the Q&A session, I just want to encourage our audience to pose questions. I can already see a number of questions coming through. Please pose questions using the Q&A setting. And then we'll be able to pose them to the audience. Sorry, to our speakers. So without further ado, I'll take them in groups of 3 questions, and then our speakers can then address them as they see appropriate. So first question is, you mentioned Russia, China, and the United States. Do you not see a role for the EU or India in Gulf relations for key actors? Another one here is, wouldn't long-term benefits of big power disengagement from the region outweigh any short-term gaps and ruptures it may create? One further question is, apart from greater focus on China and Russia, what other evidence of US disengagement from the Middle East? Any signs of military assets and bases being moved out yet? So, Lina, I think those ones are key ones for you, and maybe Abdulla, would you like to comment on that?
Okay, you'll have to remind me of the questions if you don't mind, because there's 3. I'm gonna start with the last one. I did clarify that when I talk about disengagement, I'm talking about political disengagement, not military disengagement. Having said that, there are no signs that any bases are going to be removed by the US from the region. But this is not the same as political disengagement. So now, when it comes to signs, I will say the Syrian conflict is perhaps the most vivid. I mean, here we had, under President Obama, rhetoric that was very clear, or so many thought, about not crossing red lines. Assad must go is as clear as it gets as a statement mentioned by President Obama. And yet this was not coupled with action, with policy that actually resulted in a regime change in Syria. And I will say that that kind of position set in motion a snowball that kept growing with the Trump administration and now the Biden administration vis-a-vis Syria in particular, to the extent that today we have, for example, the Caesar Act with sanctions still being implemented in the US. However, at the same time, the US is saying to countries like UAE, when it comes to the de facto normalization that I talked about earlier, if you are going to engage, don't make it without conditions, don't give it away for free. So we have a very different stance exhibited in US behavior from the official stance on paper that says the US is committed to UN Resolution 2254 and the peace process. And so this, to me, is the clearest sign that there is indeed a significant shift in how the US has been involving itself politically in the region. So I think these are 2 of the questions. If you wouldn't mind just letting me know what I haven't addressed, which I should address in other questions.
Yeah, there was one question about the role of India and the EU. Do you see them as relevant actors?
Oh, it's a very good question. When it comes to India, it's very important, first of all, geographically, to remember that India also is close to Afghanistan. And when it comes to now the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, this has a direct impact on port and maritime trade dynamics, which are very much about tying India, Afghanistan to the Gulf. So of course you have geostrategic and geoeconomic interests at play. But will India kind of engage politically beyond this kind of nexus? I don't think so, personally. When it comes to the EU, here we have a very different ballgame, and I'm glad this came out in the Q&A, and I didn't mention it, and I guess that is pretty telling. Perhaps 20 years ago, were I to give this talk, the EU would have been a significant actor in my talk. But since the 90s, the EU has not published a new declared strategy on the Middle East. In fact, the EU, I will say, is unfortunately rather irrelevant in this equation. And I recently published an article about that. I will suggest looking it up through my Twitter feed in a German journal, in which I talk about German values and behavior, and how actually there's a disconnect between the two in the way the EU and European countries deal with the region. So unfortunately, right now, the European Union does not seem to know what it wants in the region, does not seem to have a coherent policy. It seems to be very much engaged in intra-European affairs, more so than even what you'd think would be Mediterranean kind of affair interests. Even that has been overshadowed. Unfortunately, the Middle East has been cast as a place of terrorism flows, migrant flows, and that's about it, unfortunately. So here we have another big gap that I think, could have also played a positive role in the region. So thanks for flagging these two important actors.
Abdulla, Lina, Courtney, would you like to add anything before we move on to the next one? No? Okay. So I've got a question here for Courtney. The UAE has a strong position on the Muslim Brotherhood, defining it as an existential threat. But in Kuwait, they operate openly. How do you see that as having affected the UAE Kuwait bilateral relationship? And for Abdulla, a question for you is, thank you very much for the talk, Abdulla, Dr. Etaibi. How do you think the current crisis in Ukraine and gas supplies might affect this revived friendliness in the Gulf? Very interesting question. That's a good one. And then there's a question for all of the panelists. How do the panelists see the JCPOA negotiations playing out in the coming days and weeks? Courtney, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think the fact that the Brotherhood operates openly in Kuwait hasn't really affected the bilateral relationship with the UAE. I think one thing that's been interesting is seeing how Bahrain has navigated the fact that a Muslim Brotherhood branch also exists there. And despite the fact that Bahrain was part of the kind of quartet, which broke off relations with Qatar, which has been kind of vocally anti-Islamist, and yet in Bahrain, you have, obviously a Sunni Muslim Brotherhood movement, which historically has had somewhat good ties with the government. So it's been interesting seeing the way in which this has been navigated. In the Bahraini case, there was a lot of discussion about, well, this is a local Bahraini branch of the Brotherhood. It's not the same. It's distinct from the transnational movement. And I suspect there may be some similar language when it comes to the Kuwaiti Brotherhood. But I think by and large, there hasn't been too much, this hasn't really affected the bilateral ties between Kuwait and the UAE. I think oftentimes other states in the Gulf look at kind of the political stasis in Kuwait due to its really activist and outspoken parliament and say, well, this is actually a reason that we don't want, kind of more vocal parliaments or more, active, politically, powerful parliaments, because oftentimes you have these clashes between executive and legislative in Kuwait, which make it really difficult to pass legislation. So I think that's another thing that we see that comes up a lot of times is well, why would we want a system like the one in Kuwait, which, not to do with the Brotherhood, but just to do with the system itself, has led to some difficulties getting legislation through. In terms of the JCPOA, I'm eager to hear what others have to say. I'm not super optimistic in terms of the way the talks have been going. It seems like now there may be a kind of watered down deal that potentially will go through. But I think what we are seeing is the Gulf countries really taking matters into their own hands and dealing with Iran on their own terms. I think it's also interesting that we had the GCC countries saying that they did support these negotiations, whereas in 2015 there was a lot of discontent about the lack of involvement of GCC states when it came to the JCPOA. But I'm eager to hear what others have to say on that. So thank you.
Well, thank you for that. Actually, Courtney, maybe if I could just press you on the issue then of the UAE-Bahrain relations before we move on to the next one. Do you not see, given the political connections and economic connections between Bahrain and the UAE and how they've become quite advanced, the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood is existing within Bahrain, how do you see then the relations between the UAE and Bahrain? Is it the same type of pattern, or would it be affected by transnational character or national character of the Muslim Brotherhood in Bahrain?
Interesting question. I mean, I think one reason that this hasn't really come up too much in their bilateral ties, at least publicly, is that the Brotherhood in Bahrain has been relatively weak. So in the last election, didn't get a single seat in parliament, and so because they're not like a super powerful political force, it's easier to ignore them a bit. And even in Kuwait, the Brotherhood doesn't have a ton of seats in parliament. Usually, wouldn't have more than like 10% of the seats. So I think because they're not a dominant political force, they're not as relevant when it comes to the discussions between the two. But I do think that it's been interesting seeing that again, this transnational piece coming up, this idea that, this is a distinct brotherhood movement from the one that we see abroad. And also the fact that I think the Bahraini government has historically had, better relations with the local Muslim Brotherhood than with, certainly with some of the Shia movements domestically, that kind of helps. It's kind of this sense that we know them, we have it under control kind of thing, rather than them being seen as an opposition movement. But it is interesting the fact that, the Brotherhood has still been allowed to operate in Bahrain and was kind of throughout the Gulf crisis, despite all of the language about the dangers of the Brotherhood.
Very interesting. So Abdulla, do you want to comment on the issue of the current crisis in Ukraine and gas supplies?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I like the friendliness in the Gulf. So basically, here there's two parts to the question. One is the current crisis in Ukraine, and there is the gas supplies. The current crisis in Ukraine, I think it's very obvious that the Gulf don't want to be on one side for different reasons. First of all, the problem is not between the US only against Russia. It's not EU against Russia. It's like NATO against Russia here, and NATO includes Turkey, which Turkey is a very close ally to Qatar, and there is the US, who's a very good ally to all countries, and you have France, you have other countries. So I don't think they will having sides here. For the gas supply, I think the friendly relations will resist that. There will be no problems, although we're having problems with the gas supplies. Qatar can offer, but Qatar is at its capacity by end of 2021, and this is what was confirmed by the state minister of energy. Qatar don't want to supply all Europe, because then I think that could be creating tensions with Russia. Also, Emirates or Mubadala, they own the OMF, the OMF company, which actually own the work on the construction of the pipelines between Russia and Ukraine and Europe. So Emirates involved in this. They don't want Qatar to take over the gas supplies to Europe. They want to be in this, but the circumstances are not actually good enough for a new Gulf crisis or a new competition in Europe. So I think things will be all right here. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. Lina, would you like to comment on about the JCPOA negotiations, how you see them playing out in the coming weeks and days?
I mean, there is no crystal ball, unfortunately, owned by any of us external observers. My colleagues and I, do not necessarily all share the same analysis. I can tell you a lot of people in my circle, meaning the think tank circle worldwide, are more optimistic than I am. I remain rather pessimistic. I personally think that Iran is still not taking the JCPOA all that seriously because it doesn't feel it has to. I feel this is largely to do with US foreign policy regarding Iran. I personally think decoupling the JCPOA from Iran's regional role is a mistake on part of the US. And this is why Iran is basically playing games with the JCPOA negotiations. I feel if you're going to have a carrot on the table, which is a nuclear deal, you also have a viable stick that is also needed. And I don't see that playing out right now. So this is just my own rather unfortunately pessimistic outlook.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, I think it's an interesting dynamic of how China now its relations with Iran is coming into fruition, and that could also be encouraging Iran's behavior as well. So we've got a few more questions now, and I just encourage and remind everyone in the attendees just to post the questions through, and I'll be able to read them out. So a question from Dr. Ali Diroz from Ankara in Turkey. This is a question for all of the panelists. To what extent would you consider Turkey's military industry sale, especially selling drones to countries such as Azerbaijan and Ukraine, as a driver for regional actors such as the Emirates to seek a renormalization? Or would you say the traditional opportunities in trade and economics play a more important role than the military-industrial collaboration opportunities? Fascinating question. Okay, the next question, as I said, I'll take them in groups of three. This looks like a question for Courtney. To what extent are Muslim Brotherhood not internationally diffuse because of domestic factors? And to what extent is that because of state repression and securitization? Obviously, as you said, some states do view the Muslim Brotherhood as a regional threat and clamp down on them. How significant is it that repression in preventing Muslim Brotherhood realizing any potential as a transnational force? And then a further question. What is the stake in the relations between Turkey and Qatar for both states regarding international relations? So I think that's something that Abdulla, you'll hopefully be able to engage on, and also Lina as well. Courtney, why don't you start us?
Thank you. Another really good question. I mean, I would say I think that the transnationalism of the Muslim Brotherhood has been on the decline prior to repression increasing against the Brotherhood. So I think this is something that we've seen kind of, I trace it back really to the reactions during the Gulf War, that different Brotherhood movements took different stances on the American involvement in liberation of Kuwait. This led to a splintering. And so I think there's a decline, there was a decline on the transnational, which is independent of and predating repression on the domestic sphere. That said, domestic repression of the Brotherhood definitely has ramped up kind of throughout the region since the Arab Spring, and does make it more difficult, certainly on a local level, to act. But at the same time, I mean, the Brotherhood is very flexible. It's survived periods of repression before. And what ends up happening is you have personal social networks that do still exist. You have a lot of exiles in places like Turkey, in places like the UK. So they're still in contact with each other. They're still kind of talking about the ideas. And so, they can kind of survive, but in a very different, uninstitutionalized ways. But I do think that, the decline in transnationalism kind of I see it as separate from the repression piece. But at the same time, when there's a repression at home, it's really difficult to maintain links across borders as well, if that makes sense. So thank you.
Okay, Abdulla?
Yeah. Well, the question sounds like it's IR dominated, because it starts with what's at stake in the relations between Turkey and Qatar, and for both states. I think both states, especially Turkey, it suffers from problems with currency and economic problems. I think this is number one priority for the Turkish regime. Also, what's at stake is to not find yourself in a war in Eastern Europe. We saw the Turkish president visit to Ukraine to try to hopefully to find a solution between the Russians and Ukrainians. Turkey have a great relation with Ukraine, have a great relation with Russia, so they can do something in this. For Qatar, I think Qatar now is in 2022. Qatar focused more on the World Cup that's coming at the end of this year, and focusing on continuing the efforts as well to handle the issue in Afghanistan, and this is what one of the issues that both Qatar and Turkey focus on, because they both cooperate to run the airport in Afghanistan. So this is one of the issues as well in Central Asia they're focusing on. So this is the regard of the international relations. I think, like briefly, answering the question, because I think the answer is really huge and big. So it's very difficult to answer it like in 2 minutes.
But there's also the question about drones, you know, and the sale of those to countries such as Azerbaijan and Ukraine, and how that factors in. What would you think? Any comments on that, Abdulla?
Yeah, it says the first part of the question and then or. I don't think there is or. I think there are a lot of multiple factors coming into play. We can't say it's either the military factor or more the economic factor for Turkey. But I think so for the normalization, I mean, of relations with UAE. UAE knows that Turkey a few years ago wasn't actually famous in terms of military equipment. Now Turkey is very famous in the region. We see different countries buying from Turkey. We see Algeria buying. We see Qatar buying. We see Ukraine. We see Azerbaijan, and we saw them actually in action in the last confrontation between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So I think this is definitely one of the reasons, but also we can't ignore the Turkish strategic position. We can't ignore the Turkish effect in the region and in the international system as well.
Okay. Lina, over to you.
Yeah, I'm going to weigh in a bit further on the UAE-Turkey issue because I think it's worth commenting on. One thing we need to bear in mind is that the Gulf actor with which Turkey has the biggest trade engagement is actually UAE, not Qatar, interestingly enough. So despite Turkey's political closeness to Qatar, economically speaking, it trades more with UAE. The second thing is recently, as part of the rapprochement, UAE said it's allocating $10 billion to invest in Turkey. However, it is not yet clear where this investment is going to go, and perhaps defense could be one of them. If defense is one of them, this will be a clear indicator that there is political engagement that is going to happen in a more concrete way. Because to have defense investment in public companies in Turkey requires a significant bureaucratic infrastructure that allows this, which means overcoming some of the geopolitical differences between UAE and Turkey. But when you look at the geopolitical differences, you will see that despite the rapprochement that we're currently witnessing, there are some significant differences at play, particularly in the context of Libya. So we shouldn't really think that rapprochement, again, just as I was saying in my presentation, rapprochement means a complete change of track by any one actor. You know, it could be seen as contradictory to an outside observer, but this is just pragmatism and compartmentalization. Another arena to look out for is the Eastern Mediterranean, where Turkey is feeling a bit left out and it wants to have a stake in the Eastern Mediterranean gas situation. And of course, UAE has had good relations there with some of Turkey's, we can call them mild political rivals like Greece. And so this is part of the reason why Turkey may be interested in engaging. It doesn't want to be left out. And at the same time, there might be some perhaps surprising turns on the other side, such as Syria. Turkey, for the longest time, was seen as wanting to rid the Syrian state from the dominance of the Assad regime. However, right now, Turkey is really mostly looking at the Syrian conflict through the prism of the Kurdish issue. And that has been the case from the start. But in addition to that, for a while, we saw support for the Syrian opposition and Syrian rebels, and this is kind of declining. And so in some ways, UAE's de facto normalization with the Assad regime is not going to be completely unacceptable to Turkey. So here you can see both countries compartmentalizing according to what is a matter of national priority for them. And so we shouldn't, you know, be in one camp or another, thinking that's it, we're on the path of things going into full normalization between UAE and Turkey, or the other way around. It really is very, very varied.
That's great, thank you. So we've got a few more questions. Just as we still have another 10 minutes left, I encourage people to take the advantage and make a post on the chat function. So question for Lina. If you talk about the abandonment of the JCPOA, or for example, the initiation of the Gulf crisis, how can that be considered pragmatic for all those involved? If one state's pragmatism or self-interest is not another state's problem or imbroglio. So that's one key question for you to ask. Another one, and this one is for Abdulla. There are signs of competition between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. To what extent is it economic insecurity that's driving that rivalry, or is it about regime security? And one question actually I would like to ask all three panelists is, if you were to look at in the United States at the moment, and if we were to look at the challenges that the Biden administration is facing in terms of its polling numbers, do you see this as a how would you see the nature of the US engagement changing under a Republican administration if we were to see some change there? And do you see it as ripe for that? So maybe just some reflections on that. So Lina, would you like to go ahead with that question?
Right.
Or both?
It's yeah. Can you just read it again, because it was very delicately phrased.
Yeah. If you talk about the abandonment of the JCPOA, or for example, the initiation of the Gulf crisis, how can that be considered as pragmatic for all those involved?
Yeah.
Is one
Okay.
state's pragmatism not self-interest, or another state's problem its
well,
problem?
I mean, pragmatism is driven by self-interest. And this is just what foreign policy ultimately is about, because any country will first and foremost seek to serve its own national interest. And yes, this is self-interest. I mean, we're not talking about altruism here. We are talking about power. We are talking about competition. We're talking about resources, dominance. All those things mean that ultimately any state is going to put itself first. That's just the way the world is. And so abandoning the JCPOA, I guess this is in reference to the Trump era in the United States. At that time, Trump believed that he was pursuing maximum pressure on Iran. Now, personally, I think it was called maximum pressure, but in reality, it was a very messy approach to Iran. Because if you're gonna approach Iran through maximum pressure, then you need more than just abandoning the JCPOA. You need to really address Iran's regional role. And at that time, Arab Gulf countries, in particular UAE and Saudi Arabia, but mainly Saudi Arabia, felt quite betrayed by the Obama administration's what they saw as closeness to Iran with the JCPOA, and had a lot of hope that the maximum pressure declared by Trump was going to make a significant shift. But here we are, you know, the Trump administration is no more. We are in a new era, and the situation has not really changed all that much when it comes to regional, the regional role of Iran. So yes, it is pragmatism, it is self-interest, and it's just the way it is. When it comes to the Gulf crisis, again, people who probably thought that this is it, the GCC is going to unravel forever, are now, you know, looking at photos of Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed and Sheikh Tamim at the Olympics, you know, together, and I I think these observers must be trying to find an interpretation behind this, you know, declared public coming together of these two leaders who not long ago, you know, were seen as opposing political figures. It's also pragmatism, you know. Everything's fair in love and war, and this is just the way international relations are, and that's why I personally don't think that putting any country or any actor in an ideological camp is very helpful, and assuming that countries, even if they are at war, are going to be enemies forever is also helpful. I think look at Europe. World War II obviously ended a long time ago, but hey, arch rivals at that time are now, you know, political allies today, and so it's just the nature of international relations.
Excellent, thank you. Abdulla, would you like to comment?
I think Biden, new president in the White House, affecting the Gulf. I mean, this is very important because after the era of Trump, where we saw the maximum pressure he put on all the U.S. allies in the world, from security budgets in the Europe to more payments to military bases in the Gulf. So he was putting a lot of pressure against his allies. Now we see Biden. Biden is more. He's a politician for years and years, so he knows how to handle things. Things will not be on TV for us to watch it. Things will be there for us to analyze it. So I think that's what's going to happen for this is what's happening between the U.S. and the Gulf, and we saw his effect when Saudi Arabia became more more like to adopt a more let's say good foreign policy. I don't know how to put it in a good way, but more solid foreign policy. We see ending the crisis with Qatar, seeing more engagement with Iran and Iraq. We see a different language. This has to do with Biden, also has to do with the new appointments within the inner circle of Mohammed bin Salman as well. So yeah, that's pretty much what I can add. But Dr. Lina said it all.
But we also have the question about the economic competition dimension between Saudi and the UAE. What about that, Abdullah?
Of course, we're going to have economic competition, not only KSA and Saudis and the Emiratis, but we will see competition with the Qataris as well. All the Gulf countries rely on energy. So when they want to diversify their economy, they basically have the same plans to go for tourism, to head to attracting more foreign firms and foreign investments in their economies. So that puts them in competition with each other. We saw some competition when Saudis put a law in February 2021 to attract more firms to go to open offices in Saudi Arabia. That will be very costly to firms that actually based in the UAE right now, in Dubai in particular. We're gonna have problems with ports. We see Hamad ports in Qatar doing a great job with connecting with China, with connecting with Pakistan, with connecting with Africa. And now we're gonna see the Dammam port. We're gonna see and of course Jebel Ali, the dominant port in the region. So they will definitely have competitions, but I don't think competitions will go into a new Gulf crisis unless we have some circumstances such as circumstance we had in 2017.
Excellent, thank you. Courtney, would you like to comment on any of those questions? Maybe the one on the United States?
Yeah, just about the prospects for change if there were a Republican administration. I do think one thing that's interesting is, the Republican administration under George W. Bush was really identified with like a value-based foreign policy. This idea of democracy promotion was very important. With the Trump administration, we saw a kind of a bit of a shift where the Republicans were focused and have been focused more on kind of transactionalism when it comes to dealing with the Middle East, rather than kind of democracy promotion or talk about human rights even. And I think with the Biden administration, one thing that they've talked a lot about is, the importance of human rights and engagement with democracies. We saw the Summit for Democracy that was hosted in DC back in December, and this idea of kind of bringing together democratic powers. And so there is kind of more of a normative approach that we're seeing on behalf of the Democratic administration right now, at least rhetorically, in terms of, how things played out on the ground. Not a huge shift, I'd say, really, so far. But I think a Republican administration may go back to this more transactional focus that Trump had, this idea on that, we're looking out for American interests regardless of the human rights implications, regardless of, any ideas about democracies being friendly with one another. So I think that there was a perception that with the Trump administration, there was more the things were kind of decreed and got done quite quickly, whereas with Biden, there's more discussion, more more engagement about, at least on the rhetorical level, again, about human rights. And I think that could change, and we would see more focus on engaging with the Middle East kind of on American terms, on terms of like America first, especially with kind of inflation and economic issues here. So yeah, but we'll see what happens.
That's excellent. Thank you. Well, on that note, we've now come to time. So I just want to take, just this opportunity just to remark that I think today's panel has been particularly fascinating. And I want to thank each of our three speakers for what has been a very, very lively and a very interesting discussion, highlighting the issues that are taking place at a global level and how that intersects with the regional context and also the domestic factors that are taking place within each of the states within the region, and how that actually the complexity that actually exists, forces us to really to revisit our more simplistic notions of understanding international relations of the region and also the politics that is existing. So on that basis, thank you all to our speakers. I'll hand it back to my colleague, Dr. Marc Owen Jones, who would like to say a few remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I just want to finish really again by thanking again the panelists for an excellent presentation and a very complimentary presentation. I think the themes really developed well off each other, and we saw some nice discussions about transnationalism, perhaps the need not to overstate the role of identity, but also the need not to ignore it completely. I thought was a very interesting takeaway to this. Yes, the rest, I'm afraid, is just routine housekeeping. I'd like to just draw everyone's attention to the fact that we have our next panel coming up at 6 p.m. So please stay tuned. It's another great panel with a great lineup, analyzing the MENA social dynamics using natural language processing and big data methods. Again, highlighting the fact that we are trying to encourage different approaches to the study of the region. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you there. Thanks again to our panelists. And if anyone's staying online, you'll see a few slides about the College of Humanities and Social Science and some informative information about the programs that we offer. Thank you again to our speakers, and see you at the next panel. Bye-bye.
Hello. Hi. Can you hear me?
Zagwani, who will be the moderator of this session. I'm really happy to chair this panel section as part of the inaugural edition of the International Middle East Conference 2022, organized by the Middle Eastern Studies Department at the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Hamad bin Khalifa University. Natural language processing and big data are fields that are transforming our technological reality. They can help us teach machines to understand and produce human language in a quality that approaches human linguistic competence. Moreover, current advancements in machine learning, like the deep neural networks, can assist us to form new ideas about the role of traditional humanities fields and offer novel explanatory models for them. On the other hand, the MENA region is a place with a long history, rich tradition, and enormous cultural wealth and diversity. It is the place where history, religion, literature, music, politics, and sciences come together to form a unique cultural continuum. Using all these fascinating technological developments in the cultural products of the MENA region gives us an innovative view of the Middle Eastern studies. A newly emerging field of research and development is being developed that combines the digital modeling of the rich cultural space of the Arab world and the application of novel computational methods to the understanding of how cultural phenomena interact with social structures. I'm really excited that today we're hosting a panel of international experts in the NLP and big data subfields. I would like to thank them for accepting our invitation to present their research in our panel. And let me, before I start presenting them, to just mention that you can use the hashtag MEConf and tag our accounts in Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter using the handles you're seeing in your screen. Also, you can use and download these codes and download the Odyssey mobile application for interpreting English language to Arabic. Moreover, if you have any questions, you can send them through the Q&A box to all panelists, and the button is in your WebEx on the down left button, as you can see here in the screen. Finally, if you want to change the view or arrange the speakers and the tiles in your screen, you can choose your preferred layout option, again, using the buttons you can see on the slide. Now, let me start by welcoming our first speaker. It's Karim Darwish. Dr. Karim is a principal scientist at AI Explain Incorporation and the acting research director of the Arabic Language Technologies Group at the Qatar Computing Research Institute. And his main interest is related to information retrieval, digital libraries, and natural language processing. The talk of Dr. Karim will be News Consumptions in Time of Conflict, 2021, Palestinian-Israel War as an example. Dr. Karim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Can I be allowed to share my screen? Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Actually, let me, I think I need to be in this, is the presentation in full screen or just a partial screen?
It's a full screen. It's a full screen.
Okay, good. Very well. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you today about news consumption in time of conflict, and I'm going to take the 2021 Palestinian-Israeli war as an example. But before I do that, let me just tell you a bit about where I work. So I work at Explain, which is a company dedicated to making it easy to discover, benchmark, and build and deploy state-of-the-art machine learning models and solutions. So I would encourage all of you to check out my new home. Let's go back to the topic of the presentation. So back in May 2021, there was a major conflagration of hostilities between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And during the time of such conflict, there's lots of people who are sharing, commenting, and retweeting on social media and so forth. And due to the polarizing nature of this conflict, users were generally sharing and retweeting from diametrically opposed news sources. It's as if they were living in completely two different worlds when they are handling or talking about the conflict in Palestine between Palestinians and Israelis. So I guess the question that we had, given this, the way that people consume news during this time of conflict, the particular questions that we were interested in was, are users likely to share less popular or foreign news sources during the time of conflict? And if the answer is yes, why would they be sharing news from less popular sources or from foreign sources? And as you can probably tell, the answer is probably yes, and I'll show you how it's yes and some of the reasons why. And given that people start sharing from such sources, do these sources become popular post-conflict, or do they just die down after the conflict is over? So these are the three central questions that I'll be answering in this presentation. Okay. So as far as the methodology or what we did so far in the study, basically we collected lots of tweets pertaining to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And then we used the unsupervised stance detection, which is state-of-the-art, to identify the stances of roughly 8,000 users who are coming strictly from the US. And then we examined their tweets from before the conflict, during the conflict, and after the conflict, so we can see whether we can answer the three questions that I laid out previously. Okay. So as far as data collection, as I told you, we collected around 6.9 million tweets, and these they took place or they appeared on Twitter between the 17th and 19th of May. And we use keywords that are related to the conflict, things like Gaza, Israel, Zionist, Quds, Jerusalem, and so forth. And then we retained only tweets that were authored strictly in English and from US users. And when we did this, when we did the filtration, we were left with about 357,000 tweets coming from 130,000 users. And next, given those users, we identified the most active 20,000 of them, and then we proceeded to do unsupervised stance detection. If you're unfamiliar with the work, I would encourage you to go back to my paper from a couple of years ago that was published in ICWSM, where basically we would represent users using the accounts that they retweet. We construct a vector based on the accounts that they retweet. And then we project the users into a lower dimensional space, and then we cluster the users. And the accuracy of this algorithm is way above 95%. So I would encourage you to use it if you're interested. So out of these 20,000 users, the algorithm was confident about around 8,000 of them. About 6,500 were pro-Palestinian, and the remaining ones were pro-Israeli. Now that we have the data, we split them into two groups. Then we can proceed to the analysis that we're going to for the paper. So basically, for the analysis, before we delve into all the questions and so forth, I would take a look at some of we just looked at both groups and how they look like and so forth. So this is an example of a pro-Palestinian tweet. You can take 10 seconds to look at it. And the one to the lower left is a pro-Israeli tweet. So we know that our algorithm is doing a good job in separating both groups. And then we proceeded to understand what these groups were and what the news sources that they were looking at. And if you look at the top 10 news sources that each group was citing or retweeting, you'll find something that is a bit interesting. So for the pro-Palestinian group, Washington Post is a US-based news organization, and we're looking at US users. But The Guardian is not, Al Jazeera is not, and Middle East Eye is not. So, and these three other ones appeared in really at the top of the panel. And if you look at other ones, like, for example, Jewish Currents, it's not a popular news organization by any stretch of the imagination. Okay. If you look at the pro-Israeli side, you also find the same trend, where you see Jerusalem Post, which is a foreign organization, appearing all the way at the top, and some other less popular ones like Daily Caller and Sean Hannity and so forth. Okay? So this pertains to our first question, which is, given that we have a major polarizing event that is happening, are users likely to be reading less popular or foreign news sources? And the answer is clearly yes, right? And we will look at this in more detail as in the next few slides. Okay. So given that we know that this happens, and we wanted to see, as I told you, the retweet behavior across a long period of time, not just, so the answer to the first question is yes, they would consume more of foreign and less, but we want to see the behavior of the users over a prolonged period of time. So we scraped the tweets of these 8,000 users, starting from January 1st, 2021, all the way to August 17th, 2021. And in the process, we collected around 29 million tweets. So we can identify both groups, those who are pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli in this conflict. Okay. So what does the pro-Israeli group, pro-Palestinian group look like? If we looked at the most popular, the most used 30 hashtags, and you can see there are two main themes in their tweets. One of them are progressive themes, things like, Medicare for all, cancel student debt, and so forth. So they were clearly a progressive agenda type, hashtags. And there are many things that are foreign issues related. Things like Yemen can't wait, and farmers' protest in India, and things related to the Palestinian issue itself. If we look at the pro-Israeli group, the most frequent hashtags were dominated by things that are related to the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and Judaism-related terms, things like Shabbat and Jewish and Passover and so forth, which may indicate that the percentage of probably Jewish users was larger in that group than in the other group. And there were also Republican themes or conservative themes like Antifa, Biden border crisis, and so forth. So now we kind of understand which kind of the both groups, how they look like, and so forth. Now we're going to proceed to our main question, which is, do users resort to foreign and less popular sources for major polarizing events? And as I told you, the answer is yes. So here, if you look at the pro-Palestinian, group, we chose two sources that were popular news sources in the US, namely Washington Post and CNN. And we used three less popular and foreign news sources for that comparison. And those were Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, and Jewish Currents specifically, right? If you look at topically related tweets, you can see that the percentage of tweets that are related to the conflict or the Israeli-Palestinian problem, you see that during the time of the conflict, Al Jazeera was completely dominating, followed by Middle East Eye, and to lesser extent Washington Post, and CNN was almost buried inside of this tweets that are related to the conflict, which is quite interesting, because if you look at tweets that are not related to the conflict or the Palestinian issue in general, you see that the Washington Post and CNN are completely dominating. Al Jazeera fares lower, but I mean not as much, and things like Middle East Eye were almost non-existent. Okay. So So this is the first take home, right? So not only are they resorting, but they are resorting in very large numbers also. Okay? And if you look at the pro-Israeli side, things look actually slightly different. So for the pro-Israeli side, you can see that before the conflict was started, Jerusalem Post was kind of dominating. And again, I took two sources that were very popular in the US, conservative sources, namely Fox News and Breitbart, and three less popular ones, which are Jerusalem Post, Free Beacon, and Sean Hannity. And you can see that Jerusalem Post was dominating before, but as the conflict started, though people were reading Jerusalem Post, but also Breitbart and Fox News were very, very prominent. Okay, so this is different than the story that we saw for the pro-Palestinian group, where for the pro-Palestinian group, the foreign and less popular sources were completely dominating all others. And here, in this case, the answer, it's not the situation. I mean, they are popular, but generally popular sources in the US were also popular during the conflict. And if you look at off-topic tweets, you can see that Jerusalem Post doesn't even show at all. That's the gray line here to the bottom. People are not talking, they're not retweeting or they're not citing Jerusalem Post for any other topic other than the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Okay? And sources like Free Beacon and Sean Hannity, they're weaker, but again, the domination is for the top two news sources, Fox News and Breitbart. Okay? So, given this divergence of why, I mean, for pro-Palestinian group, people were overwhelmingly using foreign sources as their main source related to the conflict, and for the pro-Israeli side, that was not necessarily the case. The answer, we wanted to understand why, which is the second question for this work. Why users turned to less popular or foreign sources in the first place. And for this, we conducted quite extensive analysis on kind of tweets people were looking at and the things that they were saying. And one of the things that I know there are just too many things in the graphs, but there are a couple of things that I want to focus on specifically. The first one for the pro-Palestinian side, which is the criticism of sources. And you can see that the most criticized source was actually CNN. So whenever CNN was cited, it was actually cited in a negative light, and people were attacking CNN, right? There was also lots of other things. So this is on the pro-Palestinian side. If you look at the pro-Israeli side, the one that really stands out was expressing gratitude to the US, and this is coming from Jerusalem Post, and things that are related to reporting news, where reporting news was coming primarily from Jerusalem Post and not necessarily all the other ones, right? In fact, if you look at all the other ones, like for example, Sean Hannity and Free Beacon and so forth, you can see that the kind of rhetoric was mostly attacking, progressives, and liberals and Democrats and so forth, and generally just saying that Hamas is the one to blame for all the conundrum that's happening. Right? So the coverage was very, very different in the way that foreign sources handled the issue compared to the domestic ones. Okay. So basically, I just tried to summarize the graphs from the previous slide into these for the Palestinian side. Basically, people were looking at foreign or non-US sources or less popular sources for three primary reasons. The first one is that they were diverging from the popular sources on their side. So, for example, as I told you, that people who are pro-Palestinian were generally aligned with progressive causes, and generally news sources like CNN and Washington Post were more liberal in their stance. But in this case, there was a very sharp divergence between progressive views and the news sources like CNN. And you can see that this, like in the first tweet, there was a very clear criticism of CNN as siding with the Israeli side. So there was a divergence in how people see the world. The other one, there's a desire to know more about what's happening on the ground. And to a great extent, this is what Al Jazeera was providing. And the last one was the sharing of more sensational content. And Middle East Eye was kind of taking the lead in this kind of reporting, relating, personal stories, more dramatized content, and so forth. And if we look at the pro-Israeli side, the extreme partisanship and the sensationalism was overbearing for that side, where the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was being played as as a failure on the side of the liberals and the Democrats and so forth. And to a lesser extent, it was a desire to learn more about the specifics of what's happening on the ground. And again, it was the Jerusalem Post that was providing this kind of information. The last question, and the third and last question was, does this popularity translate into longer-term popularity? And the answer turns out probably not. I mean, we need a bit more conclusive evidence to say with a definite no, that it does not. But if you look at the pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian side, which is on the left here, you can see that sources like Al Jazeera became very, very popular around around the conflict, around the period of the conflict. But this kind of evaporated, and we're looking at really off-topic tweets here, right? So they became popular for that time, and then as the conflict subsided, then it went away. You can see the same thing for Middle East Eye, where the percentage of usage remained very, very, very small and actually dwindled after the conflict. If you look at the pro-Israeli side, you can see that Jerusalem Post, that was dominating for things that are related to the conflict, is almost non-existent at all for other topics, right? And the major news organizations like Fox News and Breitbart, just like in the case of for the liberal side, the Washington Post and CNN, went back to dominate the discourse and the conversation and what people were sharing. This is post the conflict, right? So to conclude the kind of to conclude here in one slide, and this is my last slide, is so we know that do users use less popular and foreign news sources during the time of conflict? And the answer is yes. And the reason for this is that they are interested in knowing more of what's happening on the ground, which is sometimes not available in mainstream media. Also, they're interested in sensationalism. And in the case of the pro-Palestinian group, is that there was a divergence in the points of view between the readers and the news sources that were the kind of mainstream news sources. And the answer to the last question is increased viewership is not durable beyond the time that of the conflict. So once the conflict is over, they kind of go back to the sidelines or to their initial state, or maybe lower afterwards. And this is all from my side, and thank you very much. And I apologize if I went over time.
Thank you, Dr. Karim. Thank you so much. Passing to Dr. Westy.
Yes, thank you, George. So for Dr. Karim, I think we have at least one question here. So one participant, Muhammad Rafiq Biswas, he said, how you level the tweets, Palestine and Israeli?
How do I what?
Yeah, level up. Maybe be like, how do you categorize them? Maybe that's what he meant.
Okay, so there are two types of categorization that was happening. Which ones are on topic, and this is pretty straightforward. We just use the kind of a word list, things like Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah, Israel, Palestine, Quds, and so forth. So this is as far as categorizing things that are on topic or off topic. And as far as splitting between the two groups who are pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli, as I mentioned, we used unsupervised sense detection, which is quite effective in this situation.
Mm-hmm. So this is like a model you already developed.
Yes.
And
previously
as you mentioned, I think in one of your slides, you said like this is available and people can use it.
Yes. Contact me directly, and I'll be happy to send you the code. I mean, the code is on GitHub, so if you cannot find it, just contact me, and I'll send you the code.
Great. And I think I have another comment from Reem Ashur. She said, or maybe it's like a general comment, I think, using stance detection, the extraction of the categorization to why users tune into less popular sources was done. Also, the tweets fed to the stance detection model were in both languages, Arabic and English. I think it's more like a comment. Do you have anything to add, Karim?
So the analysis was done strictly on English tweets from the US.
Mhm.
And we kind of to the exclusion of everything else. I think there was using sensation extraction of categories in one. Okay. To what extent does this show confirmation bias? You select what you like to hear. Oh, yes. So this is a question from Hassan. Yes, absolutely. Confirmation bias is a big deal. You only like to listen to things that confirm your point of view. So this is why people were turning away from CNN, is because they were not getting, the news and the spin that they were interested in, and that's just why they turned away from it. Also, Salam, Dr. Karim, thank you for sharing our amazing research. Do you think that the results that show that the appropriate senior news? So the last question from, I guess, Fatih. Yes, the issue of echo chambers. This is a big deal, actually, on social media. I mean, I would be happy to talk more about this, later. But this is why unsupervised sense detection works in the first place, right? Because people retweet who they like, and they live in, kind of closed, blobs I don't know, bubbles inside of on social media, and it's very easy to do actually on social media. It's much easier than to do than real life. So yes, so people who have a set or strong points of view, they would have, again, this relates to confirmation bias. They will listen to things and they will share from sources that confirm their point of view, and this perpetuates the separation between people and going forward. Yes.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Karim, for the great talk. I think it's really, valuable, and we learned a lot from it.
Yeah.
And it relates well to the topic of the whole conference. Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Karim. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wesley. And let's proceed to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Mohammad Imran. He's a senior scientist and lead of the crisis computing team at Qatar Computing Research Institute. And his interdisciplinary research focuses on natural language processing, social computing, applied machine learning, human-computer interaction, and stream processing areas. Dr. Mohammad will talk to us about 2 billion multilingual COVID-19 tweets with sentiment, entity, geo, and gender labels. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you very much. If you could give me the permission to share my screen. I still need permissions. All right. All right. I hope you see my screen well.
Yes.
Awesome. Thanks again for the introduction. My name is Mohammad Imran, and I work at Qatar Computing Research Institute. So today I'm going to talk about a large-scale COVID dataset that we compiled from Twitter and extended that dataset with sentiment, entity, geo, and gender label. This is a joint work, and my contributors are Umar Kazi and Fardofri. I really want to thank them for their contribution in the dataset. So you must have noticed about a constant surge in the COVID studies and data sets ever since the pandemic started. And although no doubt that these data sets are fundamental building blocks, they foster development of computational fields, they give scope, robustness, and confidence to your results. When they are in large quantity and when you have so many choices, choosing the right one becomes very difficult for the researchers. So let me briefly take you through three fundamental dimensions on which you may want to compare the data sets before choosing it for your next study. So we call them LSTs, language, space, and time dimensions. Obviously, you would agree that data sets covering more languages are useful for cross-lingual studies and language-related transfer tasks. And broader geographical coverage foster more computational comparison between geographical regions, countries, and lastly, the longer temporal coverage facilitate longitudinal and cross-sectional studies. However, when we wanted to do some in-depth study at national and subnational level, we had problems, and the situation is in front of you. So we found that existing data sets lack in several capabilities. Most of them are only in one language, and they are in English, and mainly only focus on one country, and they are restricted to a very narrow temporal coverage. Since COVID-19 is a pandemic, global phenomenon, right? So we wanted data sets that coverage that has a coverage of the whole world to initialize, to boost the studies that we want to do across countries, longitudinally look at data from different perspectives. So to bridge these gaps and to help communities in different ways, we compiled this data set, and this is the largest data set as of today, according to our information. And you can see that the data set consists of more than 2 billion tweets. And these tweets are posted by 87 million unique users across the world. We collected this data set using 800 multilingual keywords. Those were really carefully curated over time. And in terms of its LST coverage, it covers 67 languages and 218 countries, including islands, and temporarily it covers 14 months, continuous 14 months. So these are a few high-level distributions, tweets and language distribution of the data set. In the tweet distribution, you can observe that we had a very high surge in March and April in 2020, with maximum of 65 million tweets in a week. And on average, we received 33 million tweets, and the minimum was 5 million. Now you see that the data has a continuous collection. There are hills and valleys though. In September 2020, due to some issue either on the network side or on the system side, or probably on the Twitter side, there was a huge dip in the data collection. On the language coverage side, you see that there are, as I said, 67 languages covered by the data set. And here I'm only showing you the languages which have at least 10,000 tweets and above. And you can also notice that there are several MENA representative languages covered in the data set. Now, the unique point of this data set is that we extended the tweets across several latent attributes using standard machine learning and deep learning models. First of all, as we wanted to do, national and subnational studies, so geolocation is very important. So we try to attach country, state, county, and city level information to tweets wherever it's possible. Sentiment analysis is another very, potential way to look at people's perception about some difficulties or maybe unemployment or food scarcity and so on and so forth. So we did extend the data set with sentiment labels. We also extracted named entities like person, location, and organizations. And we we wanted to see who are the, these users who are posting these tweets. And we wanted to, differentiate from personal users and organizational users. And lastly, out of these personal users, we further wanted to segregate tweets into female and male gender. And you can imagine the kind of applications and research studies that can be initiated with such a data set. Now, I may not have time to cover all these attributes, but I will spend some time to look at the important attributes that we extended the data set with. So geolocation is one of them. And you know that geolocation has a very important applications in many areas. So for example, rapid identification of incidents, situational awareness, or monitoring, identifying hotspots, or sending medical assistance to some areas where there are some tweets asking some need. But the challenge is the geotag data is very scarce. Only 1 to 2% of the tweets are geotagged. And believe me, in our data set, we only had, out of 2 billion, only 2.7 million tweets are geotagged, which is 0.0001% of the whole data set. So we really wanted to see other clues in the tweets to extend it. So for that purpose, we relied on different attributes, the metadata that come with tweets. So GPS coordinates, obviously, that come with lat long, but the problem is they are only 1 to 2%. The other attribute that we relied on is the place attribute that represents the tagged location when someone tags a restaurant or a city or a famous place. Then we also looked at the self-reported locations. So users sometime, you can see in my profile, for example, I highlighted on the right side, I self-report myself in Doha, Qatar. So we try to use that self-reported locations. And then if not there, user description, you can also see in my profile that and other people, they try to report, they try to self-report where they work or where they belong and so on. So we try to leverage that information as well. And lastly, is the last resort, we try to look at tweet text and see if there are clues in tweet text which can actually tell us the tweet, a particular tweet talking about which particular location. So in this example on the right side, someone is asking about when will be the COVID vaccine available in California. So California is something, a toponym that we wanted to extract. Now, I don't have time to get into the details of different algorithms, but these are the 3 algorithms that we use to infer the geolocation and attach country, state, county, and city granularities to these tweets. And different attributes have a different treatment that we designed for. And I also want to mention that we use OpenStreetMap nominating service. This provides geocoding and reverse geocoding services. And probably in the Q&A, I can describe more if you need to know. Now, on the geoinference results, you can see that we had, so these are the occurrences of all the attributes on the left side. So you see that we had 2.7 million coordinates occur and we had 100% yield. So this means that we were able to geomap all those 2.7 million. Out of 51 million place tweets, 99% were able to find a location, a real location on the map. And for the user location, we had 88% yield, and it drastically decreased in user profile description. Obviously, there are noise and people can write anything. And in tweet text, around 26% of the tweets contained something, or we were able to find some valid location. So in total, we had 1.8 billion locations covering 218 unique countries. and 2,518 unique states or provinces, you can say, and 26,000 unique counties or districts around the world, and 24,000 unique cities around the world. Now, if we look at portion of these tweets on the world map, they look like this. So here I'm only reporting tweets with GPS and self-reported locations. Remember the 5 fields? And here we're only using 2 of them. The GPS that comes with from user device, and self-reported that user report by him or herself. So here we normalize those tweets with countries' population per 100,000 people. And you can see that the data set has a global coverage, and it contains 175 countries and 609 cities with at least 100,000 tweets. Now, next, as I told you, we extended the data set with sentiment labels. And for this purpose, we use a state-of-the-art deep learning model, which was trained on 198 million tweets. We use that model to infer the sentiment labels, positive, negative, and neutral. And here we map them on a world map. Now here there are some results as we expected, but in addition to those, there are some surprising results. Now, you can see that while the whole world was, going through several issues due to pandemic, and the obvious expectation from tweets or surveys that you can expect maybe moderate or negative sentiment of people. But surprisingly, in the Gulf countries, you can see that we observed a highly positive, sentiment. And definitely the further analysis, the further dig down is required to see what is the case here, why these countries are so positive while the whole world was so negative. So I open this research question and let you guys to further look at this. Now the numbers on the countries are the z-scores that we also computed based on the country's representative sentiment. Now, as I said, we try to identify tweets coming from personal users and then try to see the gender of those tweets. So here we are plotting the percentage of female users. And here we also try to see, plot only the countries which have some representative sampling criteria. And we set up criteria with a confidence interval of 95% and margin of error to less than 1%. And we actually discarded around 85 countries which were not meeting the representative sample. So in total, we found out of this 87 million users, 47 million users were personal, like they were not organizational, not CNN, BBC, etc. So those were personal tweets from personal users, which is 53% of the data. And out of these, 19 million from female and 26 million from male, and which was almost expected outcome in that case. Now, we also wanted to see the natural delineation of cities. You know that there are some administrative boundaries and around the countries and cities, but we wanted to see if this big data set can help us delineate cities, and that's what in the literature is called natural cities. And so basically, these are the human settlements, are where the human activities are observed in general on the Earth. And they are naturally defined from the massive geographical information based on head-tail division algorithm. So here you can notice several things. So for example, where you have a dense cluster of tweets. So basically, these are all geotag tweets. The red patches represent the administrative boundaries, but the gray patches represents the natural cities. Natural cities mean we inferred them. And you see the dense cluster are more confined to the natural cities, whereas when you have non-dense clusters of tweets, you find more natural cities in this case.
Yes, thank you, Mohammed. I think your time is up. If you can just wrap up, maybe.
Sure, yeah, I have just one few slides. So not going to take some time, but we did a study with UNDP to study the, this perceived unemployment, food insecurity, and domestic violence in Egypt and Ecuador. And we tried to see how the perception on Twitter or the reporting on Twitter correlates with the news media coverage in that. And we found several interesting patterns in that. Probably I can cover that aspect in the Q&A. And I'm not going to cover this now. So here you can find, we have a trending service. You can use this service to see the trend of any keyword in any language over all 2 billion tweets. And lastly, you can find the paper, which is recently accepted in MDPI data, and the whole data available with all the attributes on these websites. Thank you very much. And it was a pleasure to talk to you. And if you have any questions, they're most welcome.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Yes, thank you. Yeah, maybe we have, like, if you can just answer maybe one or two questions from the chat. So we have a question: how did you label the sentiment of 2 billion data in different languages?
So the classifier that we used was a multilingual classifier. It was a deep learning classifier, CNN model, and that was trained on multilingual Twitter data. So most of the time in the literature, you find these sentiment classifiers, which are trained on standard non-social media data. But this was specifically trained on social media data to have more realistic sentiment observed from the tweets.
Sure. Thank you. And there is another question. How confident are you that your geolocation inference is accurate? Location mentioned in tweets content, for example, can be misleading.
Right. So this is a very good question. And as I showed you different attributes, each attribute and granularity has different level of accuracy. And we reported that in the paper. The further details can be in the paper, but I can tell you the overall observation is that the more finer is the granularity, the less the accuracy. So for example, at country level, we were more accurate compared to the city level.
I see. Okay, great. And final question, did you remove the verified users during sentiment analysis?
Removed what, sorry?
The verified users.
No, we did not remove. Everything is included in the sentiment analysis.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mohammed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you. Amazing linguistic resource and very useful for comparative.
Definitely will use it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So let's go back to our stream of speakers now. It's come is the turn for Dr. Wally Mahdi, which is a reader at the Institute for Language Cognition and Computation at the University of Edinburgh. And he's also a faculty fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. His primary research expertise is computational social science, data mining, and natural language processing. And Dr. Wally will talk to us about the very interesting title, Understanding the Arab Region from Social Media, What Can We Learn? So Dr. Wally, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for the introduction. So actually, let me share my screen. Yeah, I hope you can see it fine now.
Yes, you can see it. Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So again, thanks for the invitation. This actually is, when I got in the invitation, I was asked to talk about a certain topic, but I said, actually, there are many examples of what we can do. This is a conference about the Middle East and about using data science to better understand the Middle East, provide more services. And we have seen the great talks by Karim and Imran. So actually here we said, okay, let's give you some examples about the talks, some of the examples I've been working on. Which actually about understanding the Arab region, which is mainly the Middle East, and from social media and what we can learn. I'm not sure if I will be adding a lot about the techniques because you have seen actually almost all of them from Karim and Muhammad, but I will try to give you more examples. That's what I'm trying to do. So just to simply summarize, my research is mainly 2 lines of research. The one is about computational social science, which is very similar to what Muhammad and Karim mentioned about actually how you understand societies, learn it from social media and other data sources. And the other part is about natural language processing, which is actually creating the technology to understand, to analyze text. Actually, for example, sentiment analysis, as Muhammad mentioned, is a very good example. How you know that this is positive or negative in different languages. This is NLP, name entity recognition. All the examples actually have been in the previous presentation. It's a very good example about NLP. So you need the second one to be able to do the first one. So this is to enable actually analyzing more data. And this is actually what we do in our lab here in Edinburgh, SMASH, Social Media Analysis and Support for Humanity. We do it in many applications, many things, but in this talk, actually, we will focus mainly on the Arab region. So we will focus in this talk about how we can do that for computational social science, focusing mainly on the Arab world. I will not get into much technical details. However, I will show you some examples, 2 detailed examples about what we can do, this amount of data and what findings we have, and really 3 summarized examples very quickly, just 1 slide about each, just to know what else could be done. So let's get directly to the talk so I don't take more time. So the first example here is actually about religious presence on social media. So you have seen actually interesting talks about COVID and about politics from Karim about the conflict in Palestine. What we are doing in social media related to our religious presence, especially in the Middle East and Arab world, where religion is a big thing. We are still a bit far from being away from religion compared to the other parts of the world. So one of the examples here, one study we did, is actually how Arabs share Quran on Twitter. So I think if you are Arabic or have Arab friends, you probably have seen the many in your network sharing Quran verses. And so we have a few interesting research questions here about what are the topics of these verses, what kind of verses usually people share on social media, and is it have the same distribution of the topics have the same distribution as it in the Quran? For example, in the Quran, there are many stories about the prophets. Is it the same? We share more stories about the prophets on social media, or we focus on a specific types of verses which has specific topics? And what are the most popular verses? If I said, what would be the most popular verse that you have seen from the Quran on Twitter, for example? What would it be? And would be there a difference between what people share if they are religious people, for example, an account for the Ministry of Awqaf in Qatar versus a normal people, or from like one person like a sheikh versus like an engineer or a doctor? So we wanted to analyze all of these kind of things. So we started simply by searching, collecting some data. And this is actually, there are some keywords that you can find with verses in Arabic, like Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Sadaq al-Azim, Yaqulullah Ta'ala, these kind of things. We started to collect some data with them. And we managed to collect within a couple of years around 5.5 million tweets. And we started to analyze actually if really a verse exists there. And we end up with around 2.6 million tweets sharing Quran from 650,000 users, different users, and they have been retweeted around 9 million times. So that was an interesting data to analyze to see actually what is going on. And also we started to label some of the most popular accounts in our data set who actually had got their verses or tweets with verses shared the most, and to label them either they are a person or a page, an interest group, like an institute, or actually they are normal people, or actually a religious content exclusive content page, like a sheikh or like a Ministry of Religion. And we start to analyze the verses there. So this is simply what we did. To do the topics, to understand what are the topics in the Quran, there was actually this interesting website that we found, which actually has been set by scholars. And it actually analyzed each verse in the Quran into one of 14 different categories. Actually, the one verse can have more than one category. But it was interesting. And even within these categories, there are subcategories, but we just focus on the parent categories here. And these are the categories. You find some verses about Sharia law, some verses about stories of the Prophet, some stories about the hereafter of the ghaibiyat, the unseen, about worshipping, about disbelief, about Muhammad, peace be upon him, about jihad, about many, many things there. So we started to label actually the verses we find in each tweet, what is the topic of this verse from this manually labels of each of these verses. Okay, so what is the most shared topics from Quran, from what we have found? We notice actually, this is actually the distribution of the Quran verses in tweets. So you can see actually here that the light blue is the distribution of this topic in the Quran itself. So you can see the hereafter and scenes are the most verses are about it. Stories of the prophets comes second. General verses which are not on a specific topic come the third, and so on. When you come and compare it to about what we have found on the tweets, it was interesting that the verse about Sharia law was the top one. So when you have a verse about something related to Sharia, about praying, about how dealing with people and these kind of things, it's related to Sharia law. So it was the top shared topic. Comes afterwards about worshipping. Comes afterwards about the Prophet Muhammad. Actually, it's interesting because a verse about the Prophet Muhammad in Quran is only around 5%. However, on Twitter, it was around 15% of the verse. So this actually was interesting. And when we compare this actually between the types of accounts sharing it, would it be different from someone who is religious versus normal account versus institute versus humans? Actually, this is actually what we found. You can see actually that it seems everyone is sharing Quran, by the way. So if it's about something that is RCE, means it's religious content exclusive. Religious content exclusive accounts focus a lot on the hereafter and scenes, which actually aligns with the Quran verses. But when you and second with the worships, telling people how to do worshipping and things like this. When it comes actually to personal accounts, the normal people who are in general, it comes actually about general comes first. But actually, it was interesting that pages which has no religious interest, they were sharing Sharia law a lot, which actually was interesting. Actually, I'm getting a question on how we detect the Quran in the part of the verse in the tweet. We had a classifier doing that, and I'm not sure if the code is public, but we can share it later. So we had something to do that. So this is actually the distribution we found. Okay, what about the top shared verses? If I asked someone what would be what do you think? So actually we have two things here. So some people shared the whole verse in the tweet. Some people shared actually part of the verse, and we actually were detecting both. So when we checked actually the most shared verses, it was actually this set of Quranic verses coming there. And you can see actually it's interesting, the last one here actually coming from the Mu'awwidat, which are the short Quran surahs at the end of the Quran. However, the top ones are actually coming from other parts in the Quran. When you check actually the fragments, just part of the verse, this actually was the ones that were mostly shared in the dataset we found. Just to summarize, I will not go into details about this, but when you check actually the topics of these verses, you can see actually the top ones are mainly about something that you share about the Quran to give you more about optimism. These actually the top shared verses or fragments in the Quran on Twitter are something to actually give you optimism about the future. Then you can find second comes the mercy of God. So verse about sharing that about mercy of the God. You'll find actually some tweets about the prophets, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and some actually you still find some parts of the verses coming about punishment, which actually coming usually to have been seen when actually people are sharing political news and saying actually that this oppression happening actually they will be punished one day. And actually still some interesting verses about actually helping others. وَمَنْ أَحْيَاهَا كَأَنَّمَا أَحْيَا النَّاسَ جَمِيعًا. This actually what we found. It was really interesting, and we got actually some feedback. Okay, there was some studies saying people are sharing Quran on social media to maybe promote jihad and extremism or whatever. So we started actually to check, okay, what about the most shared verse in the category jihad? Because some of the verses are in the category of jihad. It was actually found that in the Quran, it's only 6% shared was about jihad, but it actually on social media was only 6% as well. The top shared verse on this actually turned out to be this verse. قُلْ لَنْ يُصِيبَنَا إِلَّا مَا كَتَبَ اللَّهُ لَنَا. This one is, yes, about jihad. It was coming actually about one of the battles of the Prophet. However, actually, people are using this. If you read the verse, it's actually saying, don't worry, you will not get unless whatever was going to be in your fate. So, and you have to just rely on God. So people use this verse actually to optimism again. So even if it's coming in the context of jihad, people are taking it and using it for optimism and just thinking positively about the future. So this actually was the second an interesting thing we found. So the main observations we noticed also that 10% of the tweets we found that sharing Quran are actually automated. This comes from applications you can register to, and it will be tweeting on your behalf. Interestingly, we found that the average number of retweets for Quranic tweets, or tweets which has Quran, is around 3. However, when for the automated tweets, that is 10%, it was almost not retweeted at all. Only few of them got retweeted, everything else not retweeted. So it seems users who, when they see a Quran verse in a tweet, if it's coming from your friend, you know that your friend wrote it, probably you will retweet it. If you think that he is using an application to retweet it, then they will not retweet it, which was interesting. It was even interesting more that we found some of the accounts we checked that it was actually accounts for deceased people, people who died. But actually, it seems some of the relatives created these accounts using this automated account, tweeting behavior to make it as a sadaqah jariyah, like running to collect hasanat for them after their death. And it was also interesting that even non-RC accounts which are not religious, are coming from normal people, politicians, actors, and actually even nurseries and pages of bakery are sharing Quran. Everyone is sharing Quran on Twitter, which was really interesting finding as well. We did some qualitative analysis we surveyed around 150 Arabs, asking them if they share Quran Twitter and what they are doing. It was interesting, and we even did interview with some of them. 50% of the participants said they are really sharing Quran on Twitter, which it seems a good percentage. 50% of the people we interviewed were sharing Quran. And when you ask them about why you're doing so, the most answer we got was actually they are mainly about getting hasanat, sadaqah jariyah for them even after they die. They feel actually, when sometimes they feel the meaning of a verse, they share it online. And actually, sometimes some of them say actually it's kind of da'wah or preaching for non-Muslims or Muslims as well. So the lesson here, we notice that Arab people use social media as a place for express their religious belief. Muslims share Quran and mainly about Sharia and everything. And Arabs see social media as a good place for good deeds you do. You can read more about our paper in CCW last couple of years ago. The second one is about actually religion as well, but actually it's anti-religion this time. What about the anti-religion and social media in the Arab world? We started to discuss actually the discussion about atheism on social media in the Arab world. So you know that in most of the Arab countries, atheism is kind of criminalized or at least shamed when you say I'm an atheist. So there are some Arabs who declare their negative stance towards religion in general on Twitter. And it was interesting to see how these people are located, where they are located, and actually what they are saying, what are the discussions happening around it, how they interact or connect to other people around them. So we started to do some data collection, and we classified our users into main 4 groups. Atheist groups, which they declare clearly they are atheists, people who actually are anti-atheism, who are saying they are refuting atheism, so they are believers, but they are refuting atheism. And some people who call themselves rationalist and tanwiri. And actually, we got this classification from an expert in anthropology studies on non-religion. We started to collect around 550,000, for the accounts we collected, which around 2,000 accounts, we managed to collect all the networks, which was around 550,000 accounts. And we started to see actually their network dynamics, whom they are mostly following, whom they are mostly following, and actually mostly retweeted by them, whom they are mostly retweeting for, and actually whom they are mentioning as well. And we started to see this analysis. Just to give you a quick summary, we collect around 2,600 accounts that clearly declare in their profile that they are actually atheist or refuting atheism or whatever. So we didn't label them. It's actually their own labels. Even it was interesting for the theists that we collected. The majority were Muslims, but actually we found even Christian, Hindu, jihadi, even one Jewish. And this actually the distribution, you can see most of them are, it's clearly they are males. Some of them we don't know, it's unclear. And there are a few females, some pages, and even we found 3 accounts who are transgender. We noticed for the location, most of them, they don't specify the location. However, when the majority, when they specify the location are Arabs, and mostly coming from USA, then Egypt, and then USA as well. And it's interesting that you can find atheists are coming from all the Arab countries, especially in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. So they exist in the Arab world normally, and they say they are living there. Okay, what about the followers accounts? How they follow each other? When you check the network here, it's interestingly to see, that the atheist accounts are very depolarized from the theist accounts. So they are kind of away. And there are some actually that Tanwiri and rationalists are distributed all over the network. You can see here that they are not specifically in a certain location. When you check about the accounts they actually follow, it's interesting. You will find actually there are different types of accounts they are following, like Arab scholars. This is actually where the atheists are coming very close to the scholars who are very known sheikhs like Muhammad al-Arifi, Salman al-Auda, and others. Or actually, some of these are actually like political people who are close to in the middle, not clear there. And actually, some non-Arab accounts. Actually, the atheists, you can see them following a lot of non-Arab accounts. When it comes to the tweeting,
sorry, we have to wrap it up a little bit.
Okay, I will try to make it very quick.
Thank
So
you.
when it comes to the tweets, it's even more polarized now. You can see here, so that atheists are very polarized from the non-atheists. However, non-atheists are actually two groups. I'm sorry, the atheists are two groups. I will just pass this quickly. And when it comes to the discussion, it's even more interesting because there are even more discussion now between theists and atheists. They retweet and reply each other. However, there are a group of the atheist accounts that are totally isolated. So the findings, I will just pass this quickly. The findings here that there is a clear polarization based on religion. However, this is on the retweet and the mention and the retweet and the follow. When it comes to the discussion, there is a large discussion. They discuss with each other. And rationalists and Tanwiri are bridged in the middle. Muslim accounts, you can see actually also the atheist accounts are not one group, they are multiple groups, especially the ones who are actually totally isolated from even the Arab accounts, including the atheist ones who are tweeting mostly in English. They speak more to the people in the English world, and they don't care that much about the Arab culture at all. So you can read more about these studies in these two papers. I will just go quickly. Actually, I was having some other examples like studying actually the antecedent of support of ISIS in 2014. You can read more about this from the paper here. I will just pass it. Even the military intervention in Egypt in 2013, people change their opinion, and we noticed that only 2% changed their opinion. Not much people change their opinion. And the Facebook moderation after the Palestine conflict in last May, if Facebook was moderating it or not. What's happening, it seems that 60% of the people who checked the deleted accounts were disagree that it actually violates any of Facebook standard community standards. So there was actually an issue like this. This paper is still under submission. I was having one slide about the Arabic NLP work. If you need to more about doing NLP, you have two workshops this year, USACT and WNLP. If you are talking about shared task, if you're interested in Arabic NLP, there is a sarcasm detection task in SemiPad just finished. There is Quran question answering organized in USACT this year, and hate speech session organized here. And there is actually the Arabic SIG group that has been initialized this year. If you are interested in Arabic NLP, this is the ones you follow. So the takeaways in one slide, that we can learn a lot about our communities from social media, especially the Arab world. The good news that the computational social science is an excellent field to help you to do that. And we have a good coverage in NLP. However, the bad news, there is less amount of work in the computational social science scientists in the Arab world. And the opportunity here is for you to do more and actually have more people working in this area. That's all for me. I'm sorry for taking longer.
Many thanks, Walid. Really appreciate. I mean, like, this is it can go on, and we really can't get bored from this talk. So maybe just very quick. So I have a question from Eric Atwell. He asked you, how did you detect the Quran quote in the tweet? Did you match
I answered this during my talk that we had a classifier that actually extracts this automatically, and I'm happy to share the code if required. You just contact me. Yeah.
Okay. And Maizaki, she said, like many verses in the Quran, they have certain category and can be used in a different context, not related to that X or Y category.
That's true, and this is actually what we have shown in our examples, that it has a specific category, but it's used in a different context for different applications. Yes.
Yes. Thank you. We can't, given the time, I think we need to go to the next speaker. Thank you again, Walid, and really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Walid. So last but not least, Professor Dr. Eric Atwell. Professor Eric Atwell is a professor of artificial intelligence for language, director of the postgraduate research studies, and also online part-time Master of Science Artificial Intelligence program leader in the School of Computing at the University of Leeds, UK. And his focused research interests are artificial intelligence applied in corpus linguistics and text analytics. Professor Atwell will talk to us also in a very related theme, a very related topic, understanding the Quran, a challenge for artificial intelligence. Professor Atwell, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you see the slide?
Yes, please. Yes, excellent.
You can see it. Okay, thank you. Given that we're a bit behind time, I'm going to make this reasonably brief. Also, I've been very impressed by the papers so far, looking at huge amounts of data from Twitter and doing very sophisticated analyses. So I actually want to talk about some much more simpler things. First of all, two strands of AI research, since we have an artificial intelligence for language research group at Leeds University. One is on applying AI for understanding the Quran and other Arabic and Islamic texts. And what we've done mainly is been collecting data sets and creating data sets rather than building complex deep learning models, although we've done that too. But then I also want to look at how AI is used for understanding perspectives on the Middle East and on the Quran, particularly in the teaching at Leeds University, as an example of a British university perspective. And you might be quite surprised at how the perspective in the UK for teaching about Islam and the Quran is not what you might expect. It's not like you might expect in the Middle East. Okay. So first of all, some background. We've been working on collecting and annotating Quran and Hadith and other religious texts for quite some time. So about 10 years ago now, Kais Dukes published the Quranic Arabic Corpus online. It's a website of the Quran with rich linguistic annotations, including translations of every verse into English, into several different English translations so you can compare them, and also word-for-word translation and grammatical analyses, parts of speech analyses, and recitations by several different Quranic scholars. And this has been used for study by ordinary people and by Quranic scholars, and also for machine learning research to extract machine learning models. We've also had in the UK, the EPSRC, or Engineering and Physical Science Research Council. They're the major funder for research projects in engineering and physical sciences. So for example, we had a natural language processing working together with Arabic and Islamic studies as a research project to develop various tools for classical Arabic transcription and analysis. And a range of other projects basically to collect Arabic texts and annotate them and use them. For example, ABC, Arabic by Computer, it's now about 30 years ago, one of the very first projects to get some Arabic texts into a computer for use in teaching Arabic to non-native speakers. And then the Corpus of Contemporary Arabic, collected by Latif Al-Salaiti from Qatar. She collected something equivalent to the Brown Corpus of American English or the Lobb Corpus of British English, 1 million words of Arabic texts from representative different types of sources, magazines, newspapers, and so on, rather than just being from one source. Lots of other examples. Arabic Internet Corpus, much bigger, 50 million words of web texts. The World Wide Arabic Corpus was a representative from each country where Arabic is a native language. So we had examples of Saudi Arabic, Egyptian Arabic, and so on. The corpus for teaching about Islam was very specifically religious texts that could be used in Leeds University and other universities for teaching about Islam. The Arabic Discourse Tree Bank is Arabic text or dialogue text marked with discourse markers. So that's one of the linguistic analyses that you might have. Qur'ana is specifically the Quran, but whenever there's anaphoric reference, like he or she said something or other, there's a link to what the he or she actually refers to. In Qur'sim, this is a Quran verse similarity corpus. So if we didn't decide if verses were similar, but rather we looked to scholarly religious teachings, tafsir, telling us what verses were related, and we copied that, encoded that in the Quran. Similarly, the Quran verse topics corpus, or Qurani, this had from a religious scholar, what were the topics in the Quran, and then we annotated each verse with topic markers, so you could choose a topic and find all the verses that had covered that topic. And then finally, we worked with King Saud University to develop the King Saud University Corpus of Classical Arabic. That's like 50 million words of classical Arabic texts, that, I mean, the Quran, tafsir, hadith, and other religious texts, but also biographies of various famous people. As a sort of similar thing, nowadays there are lots of web and social media corpora, but obviously there aren't web or social media corpora of classical Arabic, so we wanted to have something equivalent. So that's just to give you an idea of what sort, so a lot of focus has been on developing resources rather than doing sophisticated deep learning analyses of the sort that other speakers have talked about. But if you want to do some analyses on classical Arabic, well, come and use some of these resources. But more recently, we have been trying to look at computational models of meaning from the Quran and Hadith. So for example, Abdulla al-Salah has tried to use ArabBERT. BERT is a superior tool from Google to notice if two sentences are related or not. Originally, they did it for English, and ArabBERT is an Arab version of that, Arabic version of that. And we used it particularly for the Quran to see if you could spot similar verses. Menwa al-Shamrai looked at two other methods for doing similar things. One using doc2vec, another one using paragraph vectors. So these are different deep learning type of models for measuring similarity. Shatta al-Tamami went on to, so we have a set of concepts in the Quran, which is an ontology. To what extent can you extend this to Hadith as well? So concepts in the Quran obviously also appear in the Hadith. It turns out there are also further concepts in the Hadith which aren't in the Quran, and therefore you have to extend this. Tagrin Tarman looked at Hadith in particular. First of all, the problem of Hadith, segmenting them into the actual message and the chain of narration, which verifies whether or not it is actually authentic or not. And she also went about collecting a collection of non-authentic Hadith so that you could learn a model for classifying if a Hadith is authentic or not authentic. Shatta al-Tamami, who was previously working on Quran and Hadith, also went to develop a collection of authentic Hadith to compare against the non-authentic Hadith so that we can build classifiers or tools for verifying authenticity of Hadith. Okay, so that's understanding the Quran and resources for analyzing the Quran in using some of these deep learning or machine learning tools. But whereas the other people have been talking about these tools for modern English and modern Arabic, we've been trying to see if you can build resources which let you apply the same sort of methods to classical Arabic, because the tools for modern Arabic don't directly apply to classical Arabic. Okay, so more recently, I've been looking at something completely different, which is probably more of interest to the other audience at this conference. So I went to the previous session, and at the previous session, they're obviously talking about politics and points of view on the Middle East, rather than computational analysis of religious texts. And understanding the Quran is a topic taught in universities, even in British universities. And one thing we have going at Leeds University at the moment, we've got a new Vice Chancellor, and she's very keen on equality and inclusion and making sure everybody is treated equally. And one particular thing she was interested in is looking at to what extent are our reading lists, to what extent is our teaching balanced and includes different opinions. Well, how do you do that automatically? How do you analyze that? Well, most modules have a reading list. So if you have a taught module, I teach courses and I'm advised that I should give the students recommendations about what they should read on the topic. And I just give them the reading list. But we also have a library website, and I'm supposed to put my reading list onto the library website. And that means there is on the library website a data set of reading lists. So we have a decolonizing reading lists project. And the aim is to look at the reading lists for particular modules or even programs and see how decolonized they are. So decolonization is a technical term. The idea, it's more important in history, where in history, a lot of courses only look at British history and don't look at other civilizations. In AI, it's not so obvious how to decolonize the AI reading lists, but we are trying to develop a tool to assess the diversity of the reading lists. And a simple way to do this is to look at the authors of the reading lists and see where did they come from, which universities do they belong to, which nationalities are they, and that gives a first indicator, not a perfect indicator, but some clue as to whether or not they are diverse. I guess what we really want to do is to look at the actual content of the text and assess the diversity of conceptual viewpoints, but that's a bit difficult. So having got this simple idea, we thought, well, let's look at, since this, I'm supposed to be talking about understanding of the Quran, so let's look at courses in Leeds on understanding the Quran. So I looked at the Leeds University program and module catalogue and found, I searched for Quran and Hadith and found a couple of modules teaching Quran history and Hadith history. And so I looked at the reading lists. However, the first thing I found is that the library website doesn't have a reading list. That doesn't mean there isn't a reading list. It just means that the lecturer, I actually happen to know the lecturer, he gives his materials direct to the students, and he doesn't want the extra hassle of having to also upload it onto the library website. I have to admit, I'm the same. I put my reading list directly onto the Blackboard virtual learning environment and even put PDFs so the students can download them directly. I don't see any extra benefit for me or for the students for me to spend half an hour or so typing the details again back into the library website just so that the data is there. So this is a problem. We can't analyze the data if we can't get hold of the data. Okay, but having said that, some lecturers do comply with the policy and do actually put their reading lists onto the library website. And that's partly because not all of them, I can put PDFs onto Blackboard fairly straightforwardly because it's quite complicated, but I feel I understand how to do it. Whereas some lecturers aren't necessarily that happy about messing about with VLE or uploading PDFs, so they just give the reading list. So I looked again for modules to do with Middle East studies and Islamic studies. And here's a good example, Introduction to the Study of Islam. There's 47 recommended books and papers and other sources. So then I built a very basic classifier according to the author names. And this is actually nothing like as complicated as some of these other algorithms. A very simple clue, if it starts with Al, it's probably an Arab name. And if it, or L is probably an Arab name. And if you just, there's a few other, so basically you have a list of typical Arab names and typical Western names, and most of the names fall straightforwardly into one or the other. And it turns out that there's quite a heavy bias. So there's only about a quarter of the names are Arab names, and about 3/4 are Western orphan names. Most of those are British or American names. There's a handful of German and Italian and other European names. And this does show a Western bias in the taught content of Introduction to the Study of Islam in a UK university. I have to say, bias within AI research simply means unbalance. There's more of one than of another. it doesn't necessarily mean bias is bad. It simply means that most of the authors are Western. Furthermore, that's just based on the names. So that in the UK, there is a tradition that a woman takes her husband's name when she marries. So then if she marries, if she's an Arab and then she marries Dr. Smith, then her name becomes Dr. Smith, and therefore you lose the information that she was Arab. And also, the names isn't really a good indicator of diversity of what's in the text. So what we really want to do is analyze the text. So the next stage, we haven't done this yet, is to look at the references in the text, and we can in turn, if you like, iteratively, if you analyze the authors of the references in the text, that will give us another picture. I predict fairly confidently that for the Western textbooks that have used, most of the references in there are also Western. But that's to see. One other thing, so that's just looking at the text and maybe the list of authors, but looking at other research on decolonizing reading lists, I did note that, for example, there's a researcher here at Leeds, Nerko Lecek. She noticed, she specifically said that she was very happy to see people of color in the sources. She actually got excited when she saw references to people of color. So it made me think, maybe if she wants to see herself reflected, she literally wants to see sources of people of color, maybe we should be using computer vision, or even we should have photographs of the authors and include the photographs in the reading list, so you can see, literally see that the authors are people of color, or possibly even use a camera to see the reader, the student, and then use a camera on the photographs of the authors, and use image processing to find a skin tone match to see how similar they are. And there are AI researchers looking at matching skin tones. Okay, maybe that's a bit far-fetched, but that's probably coming down the line. What we actually want is some more intelligent and accurate ways to measure bias in reading lists and university teaching as a way of understanding better the different perspectives. So the perspectives on Islamic studies and understanding the Quran in UK universities is very Western based, and it is just different, I expect, from what we have in Quran studies in Qatar and in the Middle East. So to summarize then, understanding the Quran and Islam is a hard challenge for AI in both ways. And I think I'm going to stop there so that we don't go too much over time. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Professor Atwell. You're more than punctual. Actually, you managed to save us quite a lot of time, but thank you so much. You did pose a very interesting aspects. Dr. Westy, you can have the floor. And
yeah, thank you so much, Eric. It's I mean, like, it's again, like, this is yeah, I thank you for the talk. It's really I mean, very unique, I mean, in the term what you try to explore with this for decolonizing the reading list. And I think it's very interesting, and I never actually saw or read something similar, actually. I have a question, I think, from Maizaki. She's asking about, like, the concept of decolonizing the reading list in Islamic studies taught in English is a bit of a stretch, she said. To be inclusive, you need to use sources written in Arabic and translate them. So what do you think, Eric?
Yeah, so I don't actually teach Islamic studies. I teach artificial intelligence and text analytics. But you're right. So I imagine that at least the authors, the texts which have Arab authors may well be translated. I don't know. But even then, those are minority. Almost all the texts are written by English speakers from the UK and America. Yeah, I agree. The aim of the project is really just initially to identify the issue, to see if there is bias, and hopefully if we present the results to the Arabic, Islamic and the Middle Eastern Studies Department, they will be interested to know, and maybe they will take some notice. I mean, at the moment in British, the Vice Chancellor who promoted this in the first place wasn't specifically looking at Middle Eastern studies. She was thinking about the university as a whole, ought to be thinking more carefully about broadening the perspectives we give. I just assume in AI, most of our references are from American, probably largely from Google and other big research labs, rather than and maybe we ought to be more inclusive even in AI.
Great. So I think we have another question. So one from the audience: are you not worried that a narrow focus on surnames is a mere symbolism labeled as decolonizing? More worryingly, it can lead to a witch hunt or even restricted academic freedom.
Okay, so the aim is to build some software which can be incorporated into the library reading list system, which gives some additional information. So at least we can say we can show the lecturer for their reading lists, it appears to be X% European and Y% non-European, or something as basic as that. And then they can go away and think about it. And the students who see the reading list can also think about it. Ideally, the students may discuss with the lecturer, why haven't we got more non-European references in it? And the lecturer is free to justify that. I could say, okay, in my course on text analytics, the standard textbook happens to be written by someone at Stanford University who happens to be European, therefore that's why I use it. And if you can think of a better textbook, then by all means suggest it.
I see. Yeah, thank you. And I think we have a comment from Dr. Karim. I think it's in the chat. He said, like, you may want to look at this paper that has a method for clustering text based on semantic representations. We use this method to isolate users with different stances. So
okay, yeah, but this is very good, and it may well be too sophisticated for our library to persuade them to actually include it in their library system. Also, that it's very important that whatever we do is readily explainable and understandable. If you say someone, we give you X% of your surnames are European, they can take that. Whereas if you say we have a deep learning stance metric here, which gives us this result, they may not trust it. I don't know. Yeah, well, have a look. Thank you.
Welcome. I think we have another question from David Bennett. He said, such an excellent study. I'm assisting a module starting next week on the Quran, and we are doing everything we can to diversify the reading list, actually. But the fact of the matter is that majority of critical works on Quranic studies written in English are written by white dudes. Yes.
Yeah. But at the moment, we don't. People don't even think about this. The idea of decolonizing reading lists is to put some information on the reading lists, so that people can think about it at least, and maybe consider maybe there are some non-white dudes out there. Maybe you're right. That the main thing is be aware that almost all your reading list is by white men, and maybe that make you think about what alternatives there might be.
Yes. Okay, we got David. He said, like, good answer. Thanks. We are trying. Okay. And another question or
a general question to the panelists, which I think is very interesting. Whether there is a great work on big data on Arabic data sets, but I feel there is a bias to social media, and especially Twitter. Do we need to decolonize data sets of Arabic? That's an interesting question. Yeah, it's.
Can I take a stab at this question?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're kind of stuck to get whatever data we can get our hands on. It happens that Facebook doesn't allow us to get any data. Other platforms are not so open, and the only one that is fairly open and easy to get data from is Twitter. So it's a bias that we just have to live with, unfortunately.
Yeah. I noticed that, like, for when I was seeing the map by Mohammed Imran, and I saw, like, in North Africa, especially the gender and so on, and since this could be based on just on Twitter, maybe it could be really biased. So we can't really infer strong conclusion. Versus if it's like in the Gulf, maybe it could be more relevant. So this is an
Also,
important point.
creating a panel of Twitter accounts that will be kind of representative of real life is a very interesting and open research problem.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I think we have other question actually. Just,
Mhm.
so we have Muhammad Dia Hammami. He said, is it better to ID author ethnicity through their surnames and through their first names?
Yeah, I agree that it's best to have as many different features as you can. Unfortunately, very often you can't get it, or sometimes you can't get their first name. There's a convention. Sometimes you just give an initial and a surname to a particularly research papers as opposed to books.
Yeah, I think the same comment with from May. I think she said, yeah, it's. Thank you. I think it would be interesting to cross various determinants such as name, nationality, language, university, country, and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, it's in the same idea.
Yeah, it's the
The
same.
big challenge we have is find what features can you find for fairly easily for all the reading list items, and probably want to extend to extract all the features we can, and then see how good that is at predicting.
Yeah, and Liman Yildirim, he added that maybe the generation, the age, and the political, even the political views are actually when relevant, because for in a reading list, if maybe you better to have some balanced and different political views. So that's what he mentioned.
Yeah, but the book isn't labeled with a political politics class. It is labeled with an author name and a year, I guess. And so the age might be good.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's not an easy task. I mean, yeah. So, great. I think we are done with it.
I think we're done. Yes.
Any other remark or any other comments from the panelists?
Can I say this is quite different from the other talks at this overall conference. So it'd be really good if the politics and social science researchers might actually want to use some of this stuff. I have the impression that some of these talks, including mine, is just basically presenting stuff that we find interesting rather than necessarily being useful for politics research or social science research. So I hope some of them have come on board this idea that you can use Twitter, for example, to study politics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, computational sociology is an emerging field, and definitely they already do that, and it's a trend, I guess. But having said that, I really want to thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Wasdi. Thank you all the panelists, the speakers. Amazing panel. I'm really proud and really, really thankful for your talks and your submissions and the discussion that followed. Let me just very briefly present you what will happen today, because I think we have a very interesting, two very interesting panels coming up. So at 4 p.m., we'll have a panel dedicated to society, cities, and space in the MENA region. It is chaired by my colleague, Dr. Sophie Richter-Devereux, and moderated by my colleague also, Dr. Carol Fada. And at 6 p.m., we'll have our last panel. Again, very, very interesting. Knowledge and Power in Palestine, the Quest for Statehood and the Marginalization of Rights. It is chaired by my colleague also, Dr. Dana Owen, and moderated by Dr. Samuel Botnach. And hopefully at 7:30 p.m. we will close this conference, which is our flagship conference of our department. And we're really, really happy to host you here. And we hope to do it again and meet again in the sequence of this conference. In the next slides, you will see, you will have a very brief snapshot of the postgraduate program we are running in our department, the Middle Eastern Studies Department. We're very proud of these programs. They're really innovative in the Arab world, in the MENA region. We have an MA in the Human Society Development and another master's in the Digital Humanities and Societies we are part of. And also we're doing, I think, a very interesting research and study on translation. And we have the Translation and Interpretation Institute and the programs that are running there. So having said that, thank you again so much for being with us today. And I really hope to meet each other in real next time.
Inshallah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, goodbye, everybody. I think this is the end. It's sort of strange how
Yes.